Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I noticed Steve had the advantage of spending much of his time telling you what I was going to talk about without my consent, knowledge, or foresight. But I think that we actually have an opportunity to be pretty adaptive, and I'm going to explain exactly what I mean by that in a few minutes with respect to what we do with the afternoon. So let me tell you what I brought in my computer, and then let me tell you how we're going to do some group decision making. So one of the things that I brought is a talk that I'd like to start with, which is showing you the future. It is a talk on the current level of innovation in clinical trial design that's being used by leading pharmaceutical companies, device manufacturers, and some academic settings that break some of the so-called common rules regarding clinical trial design. And we can use this as a way of giving you some idea of what some of the considerations are during the design of a clinical trial. So I was planning to start with that, and then we can go a couple of different directions. I thought that there was a good chance that many of you have access to data from your own clinical practice or groups of your clinical practices and would be in a position to do traditional retrospective research in order to understand your outcomes better. And I brought a presentation on how to do retrospective research properly to improve the methodologic quality, which is something that is well understood in a small number of circles and is really sort of the next step to getting a specialty that has a sparse research base off the ground. And I'm not telling you I know that you have a sparse research base. I'm just telling you I've only seen 4 of your papers, so I don't know what your research base is. The third thing that I've done is gone through several of the papers that were provided to me, and I've read them as if I was reviewing them for a medical journal. I'm a statistical methodology reviewer for JAMA, and I spent a lot of time reading studies and trying to write down what are the threats to validity, what do I wish had been done differently, what are the questions that I would have. And what I'd like to do, and I was planning to do this without slides, which is an irreversible decision because I didn't make slides, is actually talk to you about what I think are probably the most important elements of designing new trials in endodontic research and how to deal with some of the complexities that are obvious just looking at these few studies. And then at any point I'd be happy to answer questions, and some of the questions that came up right before the break are things that I think naturally will follow the discussion that we're going to have. Okay? So the decision point, which I'm going to ask you at the end of this first presentation, is do you want to hear about retrospective chart review, or do you want to go directly into a review of one of your papers and a talk about decision? And we're going to do this by showing of hands. That's how we're going to do that. Does that sound reasonable? Okay, and my goal is to keep you awake. The second person who falls over, I will do something to try to wake you up quickly. All right, so what I'm going to talk about is Bayesian and adaptive clinical trial design. The term Bayesian in this sense refers to the inferential foundation on which the trial design is built. And Steve spent a lot of time this morning talking about how the Bayesian philosophy differs from the frequentist philosophy and understanding what is probability. I am not going to talk in depth about that. I'm just going to have you take it as a matter of faith that the Bayesian foundation works in this setting. What we're going to focus on is what the term adaptive means in this setting and how it runs contrary to much of what you've been told. I have the pleasure of working with a large number of people in the setting of doing clinical trial design. These are my financial disclosures. I should specifically acknowledge that we have the benefit of support both from FDA and NIH for the process of studying clinical trial design. Okay. So we're going to talk about the philosophy of adaptive trials and how it's different than a traditional trial, what we mean. I'm going to give you an example of a trial that's actually been designed, funded by NIH, and is in the process of being started. I'm going to talk about ways you can make clinical research more efficient by changing the design as the trial is being conducted. We're going to talk about some of the implementation and logistics issues and some of the sort of current regulatory environment for this. When you design a traditional study, it's very common for someone to tell you that you need to state a single null hypothesis, and the primary goal of the study is to prove that null hypothesis is wrong to the extent that you can prove anything with statistical inference. In an adaptive design, we're going to instead think about what the real clinical goal is of the study. What is the change in behavior that you hope to achieve among clinicians if the study achieves the outcomes that you're planning on? And how is it that you can design a study to most efficiently address whatever that key question is? So a key question may be something like, what is the best dose of a drug? What is the best duration of treatment? How do I match the correct duration or number of visits of treatment to the patient's characteristics? Obviously, you don't want to have multiple visits for a patient who only needs one, and vice versa. A statistically significant p-value, even if you hadn't heard Steve's lecture, is never the goal of a trial, in fact. And that's because a statistically significant p-value doesn't tell you what the best dose of the drug is, the magnitude of the treatment effect, or how you compare the treatment selection to the individual patient. We're going to be talking about trials that take frequent looks at the data. There is a common belief in clinical trial design that you can only look at the data at the end or very few times, because each time you take a look at the data, you run the risk of forming a false positive conclusion or committing a type 1 error, and you can only take that risk so often. That was actually the origin of the comment about spending alpha. Alpha is the risk of a type 1 error. And there's this magical belief that if you look at the data, even if you don't do anything, something magically changes about the data. We're going to talk about trials that are adaptive by design, which means all of the changes we might make in the trial are pre-specified. And I'm going to talk to you about the use of simulation, where you run virtual trials in computer software to understand whether the design of your trial is a good trial or not. And I would submit to you that if any of you are in the process of designing interventional clinical trials, you always want to simulate the design prior to enrolling your first patient. So when we talk about an adaptive design, in contrast to a traditional design where you set all of the parameters for your trial ahead of time, and then you just run the trial, and at the end you count up patients or count up teeth or roots. You guys seem to count roots, teeth, people, and try to figure out what the results are. Versus an adaptive design where you plan on making planned, well-defined changes in key clinical trial characteristics like the doses of the drug, the number of treatments, the randomization ratios between the different treatments during the execution of the trial and in response to the data that arise within the trial itself. So you're learning from the trial as you go. And you might want to make these changes in order to achieve goals of efficiency, learning the right answer as quickly as possible, scientific validity, or safety. For example, you might want to learn very quickly that a particular treatment arm isn't a very good treatment arm and stop allocating patients to that treatment. In order for this to be valid, you have to be able to completely pre-specify the design so that you understand whether your entire plan for the trial has a high probability of getting you the right answer, whatever that right answer turns out to be. Just like Steve talked about, you never know the truth. It's up, I think he said it's up in the cloud somewhere. The truth is this unknown, but what you can do is you can design a trial that through simulation, you can show, regardless of what the truth is, it has a good chance, a very high probability of getting you the right answer. So this is a cartoon published in JAMA in about 2006, and it illustrates this concept that in an adaptive design, the trial may take a whole bunch of different turns, and it is actually the accumulating data within the trial that determines which path the trial takes through the various options. So another way of looking at this, and I apologize for the fact that I tend to use a pointer and it only works on one of them. I guess we'll go with the people who are sitting on the right. So in an adaptive trial, you begin with some data collection, with some initial allocation and sampling rules. The term allocation is, in a randomized trial, the rule you use to determine which treatment each incoming patient is assigned to. So a standard one would be randomized one-to-one allocation. But what if you're thinking of many different treatments? Consider a study that's, for example, looking at multiple different approaches to a root canal procedure. I'm sure you can easily think of more than 2 approaches you might want to compare. maybe there's 4, 5, 6. So your initial allocation rule might be equal randomization to each one of the 6 alternative surgical procedures. The sampling rule is how many patients you're going to enroll and follow for a particular amount of time until you take your first of many looks at the data. When you first look at the data from that first group of patients, you see if any of the stopping rules are met. The stopping rules are pre-specified patterns in the data that would cause you to stop the trial. And one of them is always that you've reached your maximum allowable sample size. And if you have not met one of the stopping rules, you can revise your allocation rules. You can say, wow, of all of the 6 surgical approaches, approach number 3 seems to be doing a little bit better. There's a little bit more rapid clearing of radiographic evidence of apical disease. You see, I've tried to learn up some of the terminology. Okay, how am I doing? Am I okay so far? Okay. And because of that, for my next group of 100 patients, I want to allocate a slightly higher than even fraction to surgical approach number 3. This does 2 things. Number 1, it's more ethical because now you're randomizing patients with some preference towards the better appearing therapy, even though you don't know which one is really better yet because it's very early in the trial and you only have short-term follow-up. It also increases the number of patients enrolled on the treatment that is most likely to be the one you care about at the end. Right? At the very end of the trial where you've looked at 6 treatments, the only 2 you care about is whatever was seen as standard, if there is a standard, and whichever one seems best. So you want the most patients on those 2 arms because those are the ones you want to be able to gain the most evidence about. You then continue data collection with this new randomization ratio, and then again look at the available data, and you continue this process in a circular fashion until eventually you meet the stopping rule that you've met your pre-planned maximum sample size, or you've been able to demonstrate with adequate assuredness the benefit of one of the treatments over the other. So that's the general idea of an adaptive clinical trial. It is continually redesigning itself in response to the accumulating data. Now, as long as you can write down the rules that are used here, you can simulate this trial in a computer program. And you can simulate it under assumptions regarding the true effectiveness of the different surgical approaches or the different endodontic approaches. And you can ask the question, if they all work equally well, how often do I get a false positive result? And that's your type 1 error rate. You can ask the question, if one of them works better than the other 5, but the other 5 are about the same, how often am I able to detect that one is better than the other 5? That would be the power of the trial design. And you can adjust these stopping rules and sampling rules and the maximum sample size to achieve control of the false discovery or type 1 error rate and achieve the necessary power or chance of finding a true treatment effect, if there is one, that you desire for the trial. Okay. So first of all, does this seem like a rational approach? Okay, it's a more interesting talk if you all say no, but... I don't think Fisher would like it. No, Fisher's upset. Okay, but he's dead. Okay.
Smoking.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, of smoking. Okay. I had actually not heard the smoking thing before. That's fascinating. Okay. So what's the historical context of this? So historically, in order to know the false discovery rate or type 1 error rate of a clinical trial, and Fisher and others, and most of the statisticians you work with, are most worried about false discovery, thinking something works when it doesn't. It's also what the FDA is most worried about. Okay? In order to calculate that, especially before computers, you had to have a very simple, a mathematically very simple structure of your trial. I know I'm going to have 100 patients in this group, I know I'm going to have 100 patients in this group, and I'm going to have a dichotomous simple outcome. It's either the tooth is healed or it isn't, or it's still survived or it hasn't. And under that case, it's very easy to write down, well, it's pretty easy to write down formulas that allows you to calculate exactly what your false discovery rate is if you use a p-value of less than 0.05 as your criteria for a positive trial. What happened, and this is sort of the social issue, is that statisticians got confused and started to think that because before we could only calculate the false discovery rate when we had simple trial designs that stayed fixed for the whole duration of the trial, they thought you had to have a fixed trial in order to have a valid result. And this was confusing convenience or tractability in the mid-20th century with what was required to have statistical and scientific rigor in the 21st century. And this is a major issue because I would submit to you that if you work in clinical research, you'll find the vast majority, it might even be all, of the statisticians you work with are uncomfortable with this approach despite the fact that it is valid, accepted by the FDA, and being used today in major pharmaceutical companies because it's more efficient and more ethical. Okay? So this became this fundamental culture of biostatistics that you shouldn't change the trial once it starts. Okay. So this, as I said, occurred because it's easiest to calculate the type 1 error rate if you hold everything fixed in the trial. But there actually are some valid reasons for trying to keep trial designs fixed. Number one, if you do it the same way we've always done it, and you get a clearly positive result, no one's going to question you, right? You have a very simple trial. There's less to question about the origin of the results. It's also logistically simpler to execute. If I have a trial where I'm going to look at dental outcomes 10 years from now, assuming I can, maybe it's in a jail setting where I know where people will be 10 years from now, if I don't have to get the data early and I can just look at them in 10 years, that's logistically very easy. If I don't need access to the accumulating data to know how to randomize my next patient because it has no effect on the randomization ratio, that's easy. So these are inherently more complicated things. And then lastly, if there is a change in the relative effectiveness of the different treatment options over time, you can run into a problem if you use data from the first part of the trial to modify the design in the second part, okay? So picture, I should be able to come up with a dental example of this, but I'm having a little trouble. But let's just say that, for example, there is a change in the microbial flora in the oral cavities over time because of changes in diet. So this is a secular trend that has nothing to do with dental intervention. But it changes the background in which you work. You can picture a setting where one approach to, now do you guys consider yourself sterilizing the canal when you work on it?
Of course.
How come you said yes and he's going like no? What do you call it? Do you call it just
Disinfection.
Disinfection, okay. So you can picture a setting where the optimal approach to disinfection of the canal might be different in 2010 or 2012 than it is in 2020 if the oral flora has changed, right? So if the treatment that looked best in the early part of your trial may not be the best treatment later. So that's a secular trend, and that can confound a trial result if you use early results to change the design later. Now this is a theoretical concern. I have trouble identifying any example where this has ever caused people to get the wrong answer. So it's an objection that's raised. My impression is that it's usually raised because of a general discomfort with this idea that has nothing to do with the real magnitude of the threat to validity associated with such changes over time. Okay. So when is this approach useful? It's useful when you have some sort of outcome that you can use to modify the trial that becomes available to you relatively soon compared to how long it takes you to run the whole trial. So one of the things that Gary has tried to educate me on is this idea that the intent of your therapy is to affect the survival of a tooth over many years, but the data on the survival of teeth over 10 and 15 years is remarkably sparse. Is that fair? Okay. So it's good if you have something early on. Now, one of the things that I've noticed is you guys seem to like to x-ray jaws a lot. And so obviously those radiographic findings may give you proximal evidence, it's not definitive, proximal evidence of the likely outcome of teeth before you know the long-term survival of those teeth, right? Correlated but not definitive. Is that fair? Okay, because we're going to talk about that, the opportunity in research associated with those X-ray results. It's useful if there's substantial morbidity risks and costs associated with the trial, because it's only worth doing something more complicated to make it more efficient if the cost of being less efficient is high. There needs to be large uncertainty regarding relative efficacy. If you knew exactly how much better one treatment is going to be than another, then there's an optimal design with a fixed sample size to find exactly that treatment effect. It's when you have no idea or you have relatively less information that you want to have some flexibility in the design. So the general principle is the less you know about the likely outcome of the trial, the more increase in efficiency is associated with allowing the design to be adaptive. Now, what we find is that clinicians who work with clinical trialists say is that they are very sure, oh yes, this is going to give me a 23% improvement in long-term survival. You say, well, where did that come from? And the first answer is because we have one study with 6 patients and the difference was 23%, and I'm sure it'll be the same number again. You guys ever heard of the law of small numbers? The law of small numbers is a psychological term coined, boy, I should know the answer to this, probably in the 70s, 1970s. That was this idea that when people see data based on very small sample sizes, they tend to think those results are highly reproducible. So they take this estimate of the treatment effect that they saw and they think they really know what it is, when in fact those likelihood curves that Steve shows would be very broad and show you have absolutely no idea what the treatment effect is going to be. Okay? The second reason clinicians tend to give very precise estimates of the treatment effect they're looking for is because their statistician has said, unless you can give me the precise estimate, I can't design your trial. Okay, so we've been conditioned into it, kind of like Pavlovian dogs. I can't tell you I don't know, so I'm going to tell you something. Okay? Has anybody ever been in one of these conversations? Wow, you guys are, consider yourself lucky. Okay. All right, and you need to be able to get your buy-in and stakeholders. So why not do this? Well, it's more difficult. The trial design is more complicated. It requires specialized programming. And there's a huge issue in the availability of statisticians who have ever been trained to do this. So as a general rule, is anybody here a statistician by training or profession? Okay, so I can say what I think. As a general rule, statisticians learn most of the techniques that they know during their PhD program in graduate school. And at that moment they graduate, they are fixed. What they know is what they know. What they're comfortable with is what they're comfortable with. And they gain a lot of experience in the practical aspects of trial design, but their fundamental thought process, their framework in which they think, doesn't change a whole lot. Okay? So if your statistician graduated from any of the traditional programs, you're pretty much stuck with what they know how to do. There's a few places, MD Anderson in Houston is one of them. I'm having a little trouble. Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, there's a few places where statisticians are taught to do innovative clinical trial design, but they're relatively rare. And if you don't have a statistician who's comfortable with this, you'll get a lot of resistance. And then there's the logistical issues I already talked about. Okay. So this is a table that summarizes the usual way clinical trials are designed compared to this more flexible or adaptive approach. In general, the flexible adaptive approach has a greater number of interim analyses. We allow the randomization ratios to be variable and to vary during the conduct of the trial. We are able to simultaneously look at more treatment arms because we also have the option of focusing future patients on the arms that turn out to be of the most clinical significance. We can use incomplete data, and we're going to talk a lot about missing data, and so we'll come back to that. The philosophy or the underlying inferential structure can be either Bayesian or frequentist. And because these things are so complicated, you can't possibly theoretically calculate whether they're high-performing designs or not, so you have to use computer simulation to figure out how well they're going to work and then modify them until they are a design that performs well. Okay. Any questions to their comments? Everybody's still vertical, so that's good. All right. I have low-hanging goals. Okay. So there's a bunch of things you can do to make a clinical trial more efficient. And I'm going to go through some of these, not the mathematics of any of them, but I'm going to try to describe them. So the first is to take frequent looks at the data with the idea of doing something in response to what you learn. There is almost nothing that you do in life where at the very beginning you say, this is my plan and I'm going to do it no matter what I learn, and then I'm just going to close my eyes and at the end I'll do it. So an example that a colleague of mine uses a lot is driving to work, and asks you, does anybody, when they have two different routes to drive to work, decide that for the next 10 years I'm going to flip a coin every morning, and no matter what the radio tells me or what the traffic looks like, am I going to drive the, alternate routes or whatever the coin determines? And what I especially don't do is start driving and drive at 45 miles an hour no matter what the traffic pattern looks like. Okay? So there's almost nothing in life, in fact I think there's nothing in life for people who survive for any length of time that you handle this way. Why we try to learn from accumulating clinical evidence in this way makes absolutely no sense. So the philosophy here is we'll take frequent looks at our data, we will allow ourselves to learn from the data, but we will do so in a way that's pre-specified so we can rigorously determine whether there's an increase in the false discovery rate associated with this strategy. Now, longitudinal modeling. The term longitudinal modeling refers to learning about the relationship between the long-term outcome you care about, let's say it's tooth survival, to short-term outcomes that are available to you, like resolution of radiographic evidence of apical periodontitis. How do you say it? Periodontitis. Periodontitis. Okay, that thing. Okay. And using that early information to make the trial more efficient. So here's the idea. The idea is I'm doing a randomized trial. So I'm again looking at multiple different surgical approaches to a root canal in a defined population. And what I want to do is maximize at the end of the trial the number of people who have teeth that have survived for 10 years. But I'm going to enroll patients for 5 years. So not a... what I can do is randomize patients proportional to the fraction, proportional to the fraction that achieve radiographic resolution of their apical disease, with the idea that I understand that apical disease is related to tooth survival. So I'm making that assumption. And therefore, at the end of 10 years, I'll have a greater chance of having more patients on the treatment that gives the best tooth survival, and I'll get more information about that treatment, as opposed to spreading all my patients across all 6 arms. Does that make sense? So the longitudinal modeling refers to the fact that sometimes you actually design the trial to learn about the relationship between the proximate endpoint, the apical disease, and the long-term endpoint, but for that to happen, you have to have some patients followed to the long-term endpoint while you're still enrolling patients. That wouldn't work well with a 10-year outcome, but it might work fine for a 2-year outcome. Okay? We'll talk about that. Response adaptive randomization is this thing I've been alluding to, where we alter the randomization proportions between the different treatment arms so that patients are more likely to be allocated to the better performing arm, and this both improves the amount of information we get about the better performing arm, whichever one that turns out to be, because you didn't know which one it was at the beginning, right? And it's more ethical because you have a greater number of patients who are likely to have good clinical outcomes. And this includes arm dropping. So you can picture a trial where you start with 6 surgical procedures, but a third of the way through it becomes obvious that surgical approach 4 and 5 we should not use, that those outcomes are substantially worse than the others, so we change their randomization probabilities to 0, and no one from then on gets randomized to those treatment arms. Okay? Yes? Right. So the answer is, what if you're wrong about your proximum outcome and it either is not correlated with the long-term outcome or maybe even negatively correlated? Right. So there's two answers to that. So there's a big difference between a proxy, where you're using an outcome in lieu of, instead of, or to replace your final outcome, versus a design where you're going to have some patients that you actually follow through to the end while you're still randomizing new patients. In that latter case,
during that time, you're going down the wrong tree, right?
just wait. Okay. The latter case, which is more common in the work that we do, so you have some patients who have their final outcome while you're still randomizing new patients. What you do is you have the longitudinal model assume there is no relationship until the data within your trial demonstrate that relationship. So you might have your first 20% of the patients allow you to see that continued radiographic evidence of apical disease does predict tooth loss. And if that is true, then you start to use the evidence of apical disease to modify your randomization proportion. So you actually check that assumption, or you verify the relationship and quantify the relationship within the trial. The example that I gave where I was using the presence of apical disease to modify the randomization proportions before I had observed any long-term outcomes, that's really one where I'm using the apical disease not as a proxy, because I'm still going to use the long-term outcomes to determine success or failure of the trial, but as a method for increasing the chance that I've allocated patients preferentially to the arms that I will ultimately be most interested in 10 years later. And yes, if I get it wrong, I get it wrong. And I'm going to give you an example that has exactly that risk. Okay? We need to be able to write down decision rules that tell us when to stop the trial, when to stop enrolling, when to stop because it's futile to continue, when to stop because the evidence is so clear that one treatment is better than the other that we ought to stop and claim success in terms of addressing the scientific question. The first point I want to make is that clinical trials should be designed to fail efficiently. It is not ethical to randomize patients in trials or even to include them in observational studies if you already can tell that the study will be unable to answer the scientific question. There's a burden in terms of the data collection, the consent issues, the potential loss of confidentiality. We have to be able to design trials to fail efficiently. This is something that's been done very, very poorly within academics and pretty poorly within industry. So one way you can design a stopping rule for futility is to ask the question, and this is inherently a Bayesian calculation, given the data I have today, what is the probability that if I continue the trial to its full enrollment, I will get a positive answer? I will show that one treatment is better than the other. And if that probability is less than some cutoff, say 10%, then the trial is futile and should be stopped immediately. This is called a predictive probability because it's not the probability of something being true right now. It's the probability that an event will happen in the future, taking into account all the uncertainty in the patients that have not yet been enrolled in the trial, but who would be enrolled should the trial be continued to full enrollment. Okay? So similarly, you can do a predicted probability calculation for success, which says, given the patients I have today, what is the probability that if I enrolled no new patients, but I followed my existing patients to the 5 or 10 years follow-up, what's the chance I'll have a positive result? And if that probability is a very high number, say 95% or above, then I can stop enrolling because I know I'm going to get the answer. I have to verify that that happens, right? Because short-term outcomes and long-term outcomes may not be the same. But it doesn't make sense to continue to enroll patients when the best evidence suggests we've already answered the question if we just sit tight. Okay? So those are examples of stopping rules for enrollment based on futility or predicted success, but they're based on Bayesian predictive probability calculations. Okay. Dose response modeling is something that is very important in drug development, and it's hard for me to picture the exact application to your field, but the concept is very important. So let's suppose I'm studying a new drug, and the range of doses that I want to evaluate is 1 milligram to 5 milligrams. And I can give 1 milligram, 2 milligrams, 3 milligrams, 4 milligrams, 5 milligrams. All of those 5 doses are available to me. And let's say I look at the outcomes of patients treated on each one of the doses, and the 1 milligram dose has a poor outcome, the 2 milligram dose has a good outcome, the 3 is medium, 4 is better, 5 is best. So I have it low, up here, and then it goes like this, okay? Do you believe the 2 milligram is actually better than the others? Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Does it bother you? Okay, good. At least good. If I can bother you, that's good. Okay. So why does it bother anybody? Why does it bother you? It doesn't make sense. So when something doesn't make sense, what you're saying is that being the true pattern of dose response would have had a very low prior probability, right? You just don't see drugs that in which 3, 4, and 5 gives you a better and better response, but 2 was the best, right? That just doesn't happen. Okay?
Unless the model you're using isn't really very good.
So the comment is, unless the model you're using isn't very good. So I would submit to you that if you think about the entire population of drugs that we have evaluated, thousands of drugs, we have never seen that dose. I'm exaggerating, right? Because I don't know. But I'll bet we have never seen that dose response. I'm certainly willing to bet you can't come up with the example where we've seen it. Okay? Okay? I'm not in your society. I can bet against him. I would not suggest any of you bet against him. That's the dynamic I've picked up so far. Okay. Okay? So this is actually not fuzzy thinking. If you've never seen a dose response pattern like that, the prior probability that this drug is going to have that dose response probability is near 0. So the evidence you would need to convince yourself that that's the true dose response would have to be overwhelming, right? Does this make sense? Okay. Therefore, when you saw that pattern in your data, the best explanation is the 2 milligram response is a fluke based on small sample size, and it looks like there's a generally increasing dose response curve, because that's a curve we often do see, right? You give too little, it doesn't work very well. The more you give, the better it works at some point. Apparently 5 milligrams wasn't where you got toxicity. Okay? That's a common dose response curve. So dose response modeling refers to the use of mathematical models about the likelihood of various relationships between adjacent doses. It's using the fact that adjacent doses tend to behave kind of similarly to rule out the possibility of these anomalous patterns, and therefore to decrease the uncertainty regarding the true dose response. This is really important if you're doing an early interim analysis of data and you don't have a lot of information, because then you may see patterns just based on small numbers that are highly counterintuitive. The point here is you can quantify that they're counterintuitive, and you can do a model that, if you will, smooths out the information. Okay. An enrichment design is a design in which you start with a broad inclusion criteria for your population. So for example, very simple situation might be one where you're looking at both primary treatment and secondary treatment. So it's just reading your literature, it's obvious that in some ways you think of those patients as different, and in some ways they behave remarkably the same. Okay? Maybe you can help me understand that at some point, but we'll move on for a second. So you can easily picture a trial in which you're looking at the advantage of one treatment over another, and you think that advantage might exist in both primary and secondary treatment, or maybe it only exists in secondary treatment. So you can start to enroll all your patients, and then if the accumulating evidence starts to suggest that the benefit is limited to those in secondary treatment, then you can stop or drop the primary treatment group and no longer enroll those. So instead of dropping an arm, you're dropping a segment of your population from further enrollment, again with the goal of focusing your resources on the population that appears to gain the most benefit from your experimental therapy. That's called an enrichment design. And then lastly, of all the approaches that we're going to illustrate is the use of simulation to understand how the trial actually performs. Okay. So the goal here, give people a second to read this. Okay. So I'm going to repeat a mistake I made the last time I gave this lecture. I'm going to ask you what you think the slide means. Who wants to interpret the slide? It's from the New Yorker. There's no right answer. This is before you had to put your captions on the last page of the New Yorker. Okay.
It was a good drug.
What?
It was a good drug.
You think it was a good drug? Okay.
He needed it, he didn't get it.
Okay, he needed it, he didn't get it. Okay? Any other interpretation? I think you're right. I think the cartoonist was implying that it's good to be in the active treatment arm. Several problems with this. First, experience has shown that it's very often best to be in the placebo arm. Okay? If you just look across trials, the placebo arm is pretty damn safe. Okay? Because as long as you get the standard of care, which is the only thing that's ethical in the placebo arm, it's often not bad. That experimental arm has all the uncertainty associated with it. The reason I put it here is to remind myself to make the point that the goal in innovative trial design is to kill as few people as possible, and so to learn during the trial about what you need to change to improve patient outcomes. The last time I gave this lecture, I asked someone to interpret it, and they said something about the belief of the patient and it being an existential comment about being a guinea pig, so moving on. Okay. So this is going to be an example of a clinical trial that's been designed, funded by the NIH, and approved by the FDA. Real example. So first I'm going to make an editorial comment. Virtually everything you know about nutritional supplements is based on lies through ads that are not regulated by Congress because they're in the pockets of the of the food supplement industry. Okay? That's just fact. You may disagree with it, but you're wrong. Okay? However,
Lies not regulated by Congress, or lies regulated by Congress.
the industry is not regulated by Congress because of an unbelievable flow of money to campaigns and the fact that there are individual Congress people with much less understanding of inference than you have in this room. So, and by the way, that's across both sides of the aisle. That's not a partisan comment. That's a generalization across all of Congress. Okay. Now, however, L-carnitine is an amino acid, so you could think of it as a food supplement, that in animal models has some evidence of supporting organ function in patients, or in animals, I guess they're not patients, with multi-organ system failure from infection or sepsis. And the reason for this is because in sepsis there's an energy deficit that leads to organ failure, and L-carnitine actually works at the level of the mitochondria to partially address this, and it's known where it works. The reason I make this point is because, one, I don't want you to think I'm just a crackpot studying amino acids, and number two, related to the point Steve made that the prior presence of a reasonable hypothesized mechanism is important for establishing the prior probability the treatment is effective. And no trial design is a good design if the prior probability of treatment effect is so low that any positive is likely to be a false positive. Okay. So the clinical setting for the trial is adult patients with severe sepsis or shock. This is a phase 2 study, so the goal is to find the right dose and to get some preliminary evidence of efficacy, to see if L-carnitine improves end organ failure and survival in patients with severe sepsis and septic shock. Okay? In order to figure out whether this trial is successful, we're going to ask the question, have we gathered enough information so that it now makes sense to do a confirmatory or phase 3 trial? So not are we sure the drug works, but is it promising enough that it's worth investing resources into doing a confirmatory trial? Because that's how you ought to make decisions, right? Not based on a p-value, but whether it really makes sense to move forward, okay? So how can that design work? So we're going to use something called the Sequential Organ Failure Assessment Score, or SOFA score, which basically counts up the amount of organ dysfunction. And so a higher number is bad because more of your organs are failing. A lower number is good. And the SOFA score is known to be a key determinant or associated with long-term survival, which is what we really care about. So the SOFA score is your early radiologic evidence of apical disease. And we're going to be talking about survival of the whole organism as opposed to teeth, but other than that, it's completely analogous. Okay. Now, when patients come in with severe sepsis or septic shock, they come in with a certain value of the SOFA score. You have no control over that. That's how sick they are. But what we care about is once we start to treat them, does that SOFA score change over 48 hours? If it gets better, which is a lower number, then the patient is responding either because of us or despite us. And if it gets higher or worse, then they're having progressive organ failure either because of us or despite us. But what we really care about is the 28-day all-cause mortality, which is the best measure of treatment effect in this particular disease. And this happens to be a disease in which I do a lot of work. Okay. So the proximate outcome is the change in the SOFA score over 48 hours. What we really want to affect is the survival of the patient over 28 days. And we want to find which of 3 doses is best and to see if they're better than 0 grams. So the doses are 6 grams, 12 grams, and 8 grams. It's an amino acid. It's really big numbers. We can enroll up to 250 subjects, and we're going to look at the data very frequently, at first after 40 subjects and then after every 12, so really lots of interim analyses. And we're going to do response-adaptive randomization where we randomize future patients according to the probability that the dose of L-carnitine is the best dose. So if there's a 50% chance that the 12-gram dose is best and a 25% chance that the 6-gram dose is best, we're going to randomize to the 12-gram with twice the probability as we would randomize to the 6-gram. Okay? And then we can stop early for futility if it looks like we weren't going to be able to answer the question, even if we went to the end. We can stop early for success if it looks like we will be able to identify the best dose and there's a good chance the drug would work in a phase 3 trial given the patients we've enrolled so far. Now, why do we think the design we came up with, and I haven't given you all the details, why do we think it's a good design? Well, it's because we have observational data from patients with this disease, and we know what their change in SOFA score was with traditional therapy, and we know what their outcome is, and we know that the change in SOFA score really does predict, to some extent, their outcome. There's a correlation. So this is like knowing that the apical disease predicts tooth survival. It makes the apical disease a reasonable thing to use to modify the trial design. And here's what we actually see as far as the performance of the trial. So I'm going to orient you towards this. I'm going to use the one on the left. So we simulate the trial under 3 different assumed truths. We don't know what the truth is regarding the effectiveness of the drug, so we make 3 different assumptions, and we want to verify that the trial does reasonable things in all 3 circumstances. The first one is the null hypothesis that it doesn't work at all. It doesn't change the SOFA score, so everything's the same as control, and it doesn't affect the mortality. We have what we call a mild effect, where only the highest dose causes a 2-point change in the SOFA score at 48 hours and a 1-point improvement at 12 grams at 48 hours. And this has this effect on mortality. The relationship between the SOFA score and the effect on mortality is based on these observational data. It's actually the pattern you see in real patients, but not patients in this trial, just real patients. Then if there was a very strong effect where it caused a marked reduction in the SOFA score, we hypothesized there would be an even greater change in mortality. But this is the null hypothesis, and this is the assumed treatment effect that we designed the trial to be able to detect. The idea is that if this is the truth, then we want the trial to be pretty good at both detecting the fact that the drug works and telling us which dose of the drug to carry forward into confirmatory testing. You don't want to have a positive result, but then take the 6-gram dose into confirmatory testing, because then you're going to have a phase 3 failure. Yes, sir?
Is this how you determine like the therapeutic index for a drug as well, in terms of what's therapeutic versus what's an overdose?
So,
would you ever see higher mortality at the highest dose?
okay, so certainly there are many drugs where you see higher mortality at a higher dose. Chemotherapy agents are classic for that. So these are theoretical relationships This is all computer simulation. There's no patient data here. I'm showing you how we figured out that this was a reasonable trial design. So we have no idea what the truth is. Okay? This is likely because most drugs don't work. This would be great if we saw that much of a treatment effect because almost no drug works in sepsis. Okay? Okay, but this is all theoretical. Okay?
How would you characterize the last group?
The figment of somebody's imagination.
You don't think that's any real chance?
No. Yeah. And so we're going to concentrate on the first two. Okay? So it turns out that if you just simulate this clinical trial, meaning on the computer, you write a program that makes up pretend patients with some random distributions of ages and survivals and various characteristics, and you put in the assumed relationship between the dose you received and your outcome, and you follow all the rules built into the clinical trial, and you do that thousands of times, like 10,000 times, what you get is the average performance of the trial under that null hypothesis over 10,000 times. And what you find is that there's a type 1 error rate of about 0.04, so a 4% chance of a false positive result. On average, about 40% of the time it stops early for futility. It says there's nothing here, forget it. And on average, you need about 200 patients before it stops. Sometimes it goes to 250, sometimes it stops earlier. And there's about 1 in 3 chance of picking the 18-gram dose, but that's just about a third of it, so that's like it's basically random. It's just looking at the noise. But you have a very low chance of, at the end, thinking you have a drug when in fact the drug does nothing. So that shows control over the type 1 error rate, even though there's lots of looks at the data. Under the scenario where there is a mild treatment effect, although this would be a great treatment effect if it exists, there's a power of 91%, which means there's a 91% probability, if this were the truth, that your trial would have a positive result and correctly identify that the drug works. It never stops for futility virtually. 68% of the time it actually figures it out before it gets to the end, saves you patience and time, and has a 99% chance of figuring out that it's this dose that ought to be carried forward into phase 3 trials. Okay, so this is pretty good trial performance. Now, because these trials are much more complicated than a traditional trial, we in fact simulate them over many, many different other possibilities. Like, what if the 12-gram is the best and the 4 and 18 are worse than 12? There's an inverted U-shaped dose response curve, and we look at the performance in all of those circumstances. Okay. Now, what about the ethics of the randomization? So if there's no effect, it doesn't matter what you get randomized to, right? You don't get hurt by being in an arm, so it really doesn't matter. But in that case, about a third of the patients end up on the control arm, and the rest of them are equally allocated to the other arms. But if the drug works, the data from the early patients alters the randomization, and you get almost half of all of the patients allocated to the best arm and therefore having the best chance of survival, even though you didn't know which arm that was likely to be. So you examined 4 arms and still got half your patients on the better arm. Now, you could have gotten half your patients on the better arm if you just allocated patients between 0 grams and 18 grams, as long as you knew 18 grams was the best. But what if 12 grams was, or 6 grams? You would have missed that opportunity. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay. So these graphs simply show that if the drug works, you get most of your patients on the most effective dose. It shows that you have a very good chance of picking the right dose at the end, the 18-gram versus the 12-gram. Okay. And as I mentioned, this was recently funded and is being led by Alan Jones, who's at the University of Mississippi. So this really is a trial that he's doing all the sweat and heavy lifting on. Okay. Now, doing a trial like this is really complicated because you're doing this in multiple centers. They're planning to have 5 to 7 clinical sites. In order to inform the adaptation, you have to be able to get the clinical data from each of those sites. You have to get the drug to the sites. You have to get the data from the sites up to the data management. Then you have to get your survival and SOFA score data to your data analysis people who then do the adaptive algorithm and update the randomization system so you can allocate your future patients in your next group of patients appropriately. So this is very complicated. And then this needs to be overseen by a data and safety monitoring board, usually a steering committee, and then at some point the sponsor who's paying for the whole thing, in this case the NIH, wants to know that everything is going okay. So that it requires lots of moving pieces. This is not something that one does in one's spare time. Okay. One of the questions that I sometimes get asked is, well, every time you make a change in the trial, doesn't your ethics committee or your institutional review board have to re-review it? So don't you have to stop the trial? And the answer is no. The IRB or your ethics committee reviews the ethics of the entire trial design, the whole plan. And as long as you follow your plan, it does not require re-review. Okay? So that is not a barrier. I'm going to skip this. And I just want to point out that, in fact, there are FDA guidance documents. There's a final guidance on the use of Bayesian statistics in device trials. Much of the work that you do is obviously device-based. And so this is a good thing if you want to know more about how the FDA thinks about Bayesian statistics. And then there's a draft guidance that's actually from the biologics and drug side of FDA on the use of adaptive trial designs. It goes through many of the same concepts I've talked about, the need for pre-specification, the importance of simulation, and the opportunities for increased ethical balance or efficiency. Okay. I'm going to talk about this in a different setting. Okay. So what I've been talking about during this period of time, last hour, is an approach to clinical trial designs that breaks many of the usual rules, is complicated, it's logistically hard, it's generally expensive. It is, however, not expensive compared to the amount of money that we waste on clinical trials that continue when the answer could have already been obtained had they been designed more efficiently, right? So if we spend $50,000 on designing an adaptive trial, and we save 10 patients in a sepsis trial, each patient usually costs $8,000 to $10,000 to enroll when you do all the costs. We've saved money, let alone we've avoided exposing those 10 patients to a less efficacious therapy, whichever one in the trial that turned out to be. When used appropriately, adaptive designs therefore can improve efficiency and reduce cost, maximize the information you get because you end up with more patients on the arm you're most interested in, and they can minimize risk to the subjects and also to the sponsor. A sponsor doesn't want to pay for the second half of a trial that was unnecessary just because no one looked at the data. But an adaptive trial will not save a treatment. An adaptive design will not save a treatment that doesn't work or a trial that was poorly designed. For example, lost to follow-up, those kinds of things. Okay, I'll stop there and take any questions. Yes?
What kind of software are you guys using to create these models? Is there like an industry standard, or are you just finding the smart guy and having him right?
Well, there's a lot to be said for the strategy of finding the smart guy. Okay? So the answer to that is that there's a number of different companies, and whether the number is 2 to 5 depends on how you define software to do this. But there's a handful of companies that have packages that do some elements of what I've described to you. I work with a particular consulting group that has a particular software package. I'm not going to name the group or the package, okay, that does the modeling that I showed you. It is a particularly more complex version of the software compared to what some else of what's out there. Okay? Yes, sir.
What type of sample sizes do you aim for? Obviously, greater numbers give you more statistical power relevance, but what's the ballpark in this clinical trial?
Yeah, so the sample size required for a clinical trial is to the first approximation, completely dependent on the size of the treatment effect you're looking for and the event rate, and then the second thing is the event rate in the population, right? So if it's a very rare event rate, you know, you're looking for something that almost never happens, you need a huge number of patients just to see enough events. But an adaptive design can frequently reduce the required average sample size. It's now not a single number, right? Because you don't know how far it's going to go, by 30 to 50%. But it can also work the other way, because an adaptive design, if the treatment effect is halfway between no effect and the effect you were looking for, the adaptive design will make the trial take more patients because it has figured out that you're going to need more patients to know for sure whether the treatment works at all. So the way I try to describe it is that the adaptive approach gives you a greater assurance that the sample size is the right sample size for the question, as opposed to always being smaller or always being larger. Okay? Other questions on any of this? Yes, sir.
Is this kind of a trial well accepted in the pharmaceutical industry?
So the question is, how well accepted is this in the pharmaceutical industry? So the phase 2 approach that I described to you is very well accepted. The reason for that is because the FDA, the regulators, aren't worried about phase 2 designs. The reason they're not worried is because phase 2 data aren't used to get approvals of drugs. They're used to get the right dose to then test in a confirmatory study. And the regulators pay a lot more attention to the rigor of the design in the confirmatory studies. So this is completely well accepted, and most of the major pharmaceutical companies are using approaches like this to improve the efficiency with which they identify drugs to carry forward or the right doses. The draft FDA guidance that I illustrated from the biologics and drug centers is a draft guidance on the use of adaptive approaches in confirmatory phase 3 studies, so it lays out the regulatory landscape for the confirmatory studies. And there it's a little less clear. Okay? Any other questions? Okay, then it's time for our decision. So we can talk about retrospective chart review methodology, or we can turn off the slides and talk about how you would design a trial of endodontics and sort of what the methodologic challenges are there. Okay? You can do both. Yeah. Okay. So you look really enthusiastic. Not all of your compatriots have the same smile you have on right now. Okay? All right. This is one step look ahead. We're just deciding what's next. Okay? How many people want to hear about retrospective chart designs next? How many people want to turn off the slides and talk about design of trials in endodontics? God, you guys. Okay, so I think what we'll do is we'll in the idea of switching it up, we'll talk about endodontics trial design, okay, and just what my thoughts are reading your literature, and then we'll come back to the retrospective chart review. Okay, that's my best guess from the vote here. Now, in terms of timing.
John can stay here all night.
Oh, I'm sorry?
He can stay here all night.
Okay. Okay. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to, let's see if we can turn those off for a second. I'm going to get my notes here. Excuse me. We can bring the lights up. Hopefully we wake up a couple of people. Okay. So this is an experiment, and you can tell Gary later how it went. What we're going to do is I'm going to step through, just verbally, the components I would look at or think about if I was either designing a trial of an intervention in endodontics or was reading a manuscript reporting such a trial. And we're going to sort of talk about what the considerations are, component by component. And then we're going to come back to one of the papers that was provided to me and try to put that study in the context of what we've just discussed. Okay? Never done this before. We're making it up. We'll see how it goes. Okay? So the first thing that I would look at is this question of the population enrolled in the trial. How do you define the population? And the goal in a clinical trial is that the criteria used to define the population enrolled in the trial need to be a set of criteria that a future endodontist can use when they see a patient to unambiguously answer the question, is this patient a member of the population that was in that trial that I just read? Okay? So it can't be based on vague criteria. It can't be convenience. It has to be something objective. It needs to be described prospectively so that the rules for defining the patient population were written down before the first patient was enrolled. They need to be applied in a sequential manner so that every patient who comes into the settings in which the trial is being conducted who meet those enrollment criteria are at least approached for consent. There needs to be a way of tracking the number of patients who are approached but decline consent. This is different than loss to follow-up, by the way. So there's people you ask, is it okay if I write down these things and include you in the study? And they say, hell no. You want to keep track not of the characteristics of those patients. I happen to think, and I'm in a minority in what I'm about to say, I happen to think it's unethical when someone tells you they don't want to be in your study to write down stuff about them for your study. I think that's disingenuous. But you can count them and say how many people said no. It should be unambiguous when the patient is in your study and when they are not. And this is a surprisingly vague thing. So in an observational study where you say, in one of your papers said, we included everybody who was treated in a practice between these two periods of time. I couldn't tell, and then later on they say patients signed consent. So if a patient had 2 teeth done, were they always in the study as long as the first tooth was done? Were they in the study from the time they signed consent, but anything that happened before they signed consent was not part of the study? There should be an unambiguous time point, and for most clinical research, that time point is the moment they sign the consent form. Okay? So it should be clear when that occurs. In tracking the population enrolled in the trial over time, you should never lose anybody. So if you start with 10,422 patients at the beginning, you should be able to add up the lists of where everybody ended up. This number returned this year, this many people came back this year, these many were lost to follow-up, these people died. And you should be able to add up all those numbers and get back to the 10,422 or whatever I said. So there should be nobody. Now, how many people know what a consort diagram is? Okay, so the consort statement is a standard approach to the reporting of results of clinical trials. And a consort diagram is this sort of generic term for a figure that tracks graphically what happened to all the patients. So everybody who's approached should be listed at the top box. The first branch point is how many declined consent. Then you have the total number enrolled, right? As soon as you sign consent, you're in your trial. And then everybody should add up. So if you add up 2 boxes down here, it always makes it results in the number of the box right above it, et cetera, and it all adds up. The reason for this is that there was a long and unfortunate tradition in clinical research of sort of omitting to mention how many people got lost along the ways and reporting things as percentages instead of raw numbers, which hid the fact that patients were lost to follow-up and made it so the reviewers didn't ask the question, what happened to those people? Did they not come back because they had great outcomes and didn't need you anymore? Did they come back because they had such poor outcomes they didn't like you anymore? Or in my specialty, did they not come back because they were dead and couldn't get back? Okay? So all of those are possibilities, and if you don't know how many people fell into that loss to follow-up category, you can't know how much you should be worried about. The last general concept, yes, sir?
Why is it important that it be the actual number instead of a percentage? What is the distinction?
Well, the distinction, if all the percentages are reported so you could back calculate everything, it doesn't really matter. Although I like numbers because if I know there's 6 patients who didn't return, I can look in the paper for where it says there were 6 patients who didn't return, 2 we know left the area, 2 we know died, and 2 were sent to Iraq. And I can sort of see if it all makes sense. Okay? So the last thing that I would think about, it has to do with the unit of analysis. So when I first started reading your papers, I thought that you guys treated teeth within mouths within patients within practices. But then later on, it looks like you treat roots within teeth within mouths within patients within practices. Okay? So, what? It's not a problem as long as you're clear what it is you're thinking of as you're counting. So if I talk about a % survival, what is it? Survival of what? Is it a root? Presumably it's of a tooth, or is it the % chance that that patient has no teeth extracted that you've worked on? Because sometimes there's multiple teeth, I gather. Okay. Now, it doesn't really matter what the unit of analysis is, as long as it is clear from the beginning and the statistical analysis takes into account the fact that all those roots live within one tooth and all those teeth live within one mouth, and that mouth lives within one patient who lives within one practice. That's called clustering, and we're going to come back to that, and that's a big, big issue for what you do. Okay? So those are the comments about population. Any questions, comments, arguments would be good. Anything to keep people awake about populations, defining population. Yes, sir?
A lot of studies will throw out patients if they have certain medical conditions like diabetes or if they're smokers. But then when in clinical practice, you treat all these patients. What are your thoughts on excluding patients based on?
So this gets a little bit at the distinction between an efficacy trial and an effectiveness trial. So an efficacy trial is intended to precisely identify the relative treatment effect of an approach relative to some control, usually in a very narrowly defined setting. So young people, non-diabetics, non-smokers, with no history of X. Okay? And then the results only tell you about the effectiveness in that population, which may not be adequate to inform your treatment decisions for many other populations like you've mentioned. In an effectiveness trial, the goal is to adequately estimate the treatment, the benefit of one choice of therapy over another, averaged over all the variability in patient types, comorbidities, surgical skill, all those other confounders, like compliance with your instructions, okay, that affect outcome. So for the kinds of work you're doing, my personal belief is that most of your research that's practice-based ought to be structured as effectiveness research, and you should include everybody. But you have to capture those comorbidities because you want to be able to determine whether there's an interaction between that comorbidity and a treatment effect. Does an approach only work in non-smokers? Okay? And your statistical analysis plan has to identify those pre-specified subgroups, smokers, diabetics, people over the age of 70, secondary treatments instead of primary treatments, whatever it is, so that you have a pre-planned way of going through that and seeing if the treatment effect differs by those different definitions.
You can adjust for that at the beginning of the trial?
Yeah, I wouldn't use the term adjust. You can use those variables, which are baseline characteristics, to pre-specify subgroups that may be clinically distinct. And then you can pre-specify statistical analyses that are a little bit exploratory to look for a treatment by subgroup interaction. The term interaction, this is getting a little bit farther down my list here, the term interaction means that one characteristic, like whether you smoke, affects the magnitude of the benefit associated with the treatment choice. So I assume smoking is bad for endodontal outcomes, is it? We don't know. Well, diabetes is, right? Can we agree? Oh my God. Okay. What's bad? What puts the patient in a worse risk category in terms of their long-term outcome?
Divorce, menopausal females.
Okay, I'm not touching that one. Okay. Okay. All right. Here, this gentleman is sure of himself, so we're going to go with this, okay? Okay, so let's do smoking, okay? So the first thing that's important is that smoking has to be a baseline variable because you can picture that your treatment selection might change smoking behavior. So you have to collect it at baseline because it's before the treatment that you're going to have to decide whether or not the smoking is important in making a treatment decision. So that's a baseline characteristic. It defines two subgroups, smoking and non-smoking. You estimate the benefit of the treatment choice separately in those two subgroups, and it's a relative benefit against the outcome without that treatment choice in the same subgroup. So if smokers do worse, it's not the question, do smokers do worse? The question is, do smokers respond differently to therapy so that a different treatment choice is appropriate in smokers, right? Because what you're trying to learn about is what the right treatment choice is. So if there is an effect of the smoking behavior or smoking categorization on the magnitude of the treatment effect, that's called an interaction, and you can systematically look for an interaction as you go through those pre-specified subgroups to see if it looks like the treatment only works in a subset of the patients in your population. For the kind of work that you're doing, my impression is that's a much better strategy. Enroll all comers, pre-specify the subgroups, do your primary analysis on everybody, but then have pre-specified subgroup analyses is a better way of teasing out the most clinically relevant information from the population that you enroll. That's my impression. By the way, it's a judgment call. Different people might give you different answers. Okay? Other questions? Yes, sir.
How about identifying lots of factors, because you can, and going through retrospectively and looking at each one of those? You know, just saying, we're not going to deal with this right now, but we're going to just collect all this data right off the bat. And later on, we'll go back through and look at it.
Right.
Is that inappropriate?
Yes. Just in case anybody has a short attention span, I want to get to that. Okay. The reason it's inappropriate, it has to do with the prior probability that any particular one of those is an important predictor. So one of the problems in one of the manuscripts or the papers that was given to me was the method of model generation, where they basically did this laundry list approach, okay? And then they wrote it up in just pages and pages of text that made it sound all scientific, but in fact it was a laundry list approach. And the chance that any one of those predictors was important, I don't know what it is, but the chance that they got the exact pattern of predictors right is very, very small, okay? And we'll talk about that. So just keep I think of that as variable selection, and the answer is you want to pick your variables not based on the pattern of your data, meaning which ones you're going to look at. You want to select the variables you're going to look at based on what you think is biologically plausible as a predictor, and then use the data that you gather to either increase or decrease your estimate of the probability that it is an important predictor. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Other questions? Okay. So I want to talk about clustering for a second. So this clustering is this idea that there's a natural hierarchical structure to whatever it is you're counting, right? So the unit of analysis is what you're counting. It could be roots, teeth, mouths, people. I'm going to assume for a second that it's teeth, but if you want to think of roots, that's fine. But I assume that when one root dies, there's a good chance the rest of the tooth dies. Is that right? Okay. Okay. I just want to assure you that in my practice, my method of dealing with dental issues is I have an oral maxillofacial surgeon on call 24/7. Okay, and I'm very good at the phone. Okay, I didn't want to scare you. Okay. So if the unit of analysis is the tooth, and some patients have multiple teeth treated within the trial or in the observational study, those teeth share characteristics that are independent of your treatment approach, right? Same diet, same comorbidities in the patient, same presumably microbial flora on the left and right side of the mouth, okay? And so the outcomes of those teeth, those two teeth living in the same mouth, are going to be more highly correlated than the same two teeth if they happen to live in different mouths, right? Statistical inference is based on this assumption that each measurement is statistically independent of the others, right? This is, independent and identically distributed distributions or populations. That assumption is violated when you have clustering. So there are statistical methods that adjust for that correlation and get you a correct or accurate statistical analysis. And that's a very important thing in the specialty that you do, unless you do something artificial, like say, I'm only going to consider the first tooth treated within the individual mouth. However, there was some talk this morning about surgical skill, right? So all of your patients are clustered within either your individual surgical practice or the practice within your group. An individual endodontist, I'm sure, does things more consistently day to day than if I randomly picked 20 endodontists and saw what they did on any individual day, right? Your behavior on Tuesday is not the same as, but it's correlated with your behavior on Monday, okay? So there is clustering of patients within endodontal practice, and that is really, really important. And that clustering within endodontal practice may also be because of other characteristics your patient population shares that you cannot measure and account for, okay? So my wife has recently gone to an endodontist, had a very good experience and outcome. I just want to tell you, no, not 10 years ago. Now you have me worried. Okay. I just have to tell you the consent made it very clear that the outcomes were unknown. I have to say it was pretty much she could have died at any point and it would have been covered. Okay. Thank you for that. I have absolutely no idea where I was going with this. Okay, she went to an endodontal practice. And when you look around the waiting room, okay, the correlation in characteristics among patients in that waiting room was remarkable. The age distribution, sociocultural economic factors were very homogeneous. So there's clustering of patient type within that practice that even goes beyond the fact that I believe that endodontist does things as similarly each day as he can to the day before, okay? So clustering takes into account other factors that you may not capture in your data collection, okay. Any comments on clustering, questions on that? Yes?
Well, so then when you're designing a study, because we've had some studies where, you know, all treatment was carried out by the same clinician in his office. Is that, they're saying that is a good thing, but is it beneficial because not all patients go to that clinician? Is it beneficial to spread it out over multiple centers, multiple offices?
Right, so that has to do with your definition of what beneficial means. So if your goal is to generate evidence that can be used to understand treatment selections across populations of endodontists, the trial is almost worthless. Okay, it's hypothesis generating. What it tells you is which is the best treatment in Bob's hands. And if you're going to Bob, it's very, very relevant. So this is the difference between internal validity and external validity. So let's first make a quick digression to the distinction between reliability and validity. I'm not going to quiz you on this, so you can raise your hands without fear. How many of you think you could state the definitions of and difference between reliability and validity? Okay, so this is a useful, that wasn't really much of a raising your hand, okay? Okay, so this is really critical. When you talk about a car starting in the morning, which term do you use? Reliable. What does that mean? It means it does the same thing every time. Now, hopefully it means it turns on every time, okay? But the term reliable is the degree with which, with repeated execution of the same things, the same thing happens. It does not necessarily mean it's right or good, okay? So a car that has no battery at all is reliable. It's just not valuable, okay? Because the same thing happens every time. Validity is the degree with which something that you observe or measure means what you think it should mean. So when you ask about a study in which all the patients were enrolled in a single endodontist office, it has internal validity because it's a very good way of understanding what works in that practitioner's hand in his office, in his population, her office or population, okay? It has very little external validity because I have no idea if those data reflect what would happen in the part of the world that's external to that endodontal practice. Okay? So that's, and when we critique trial designs and manuscripts, we comment on threats to internal validity, like unplanned interim analyses, multiple looks, poor statistical analysis, and threats to external validity, like single center studies, right? Because you're not going to get external validity unless you show that the behavior you see tends to be the same across multiple practices, multiple geographic areas, multiple patient populations. Okay, does that address your question? Yeah. Okay. Any other questions on? Okay. So by the way, my plan is to go to 3:30 and take a break, which Gary tells me if I say 10 minutes, it'll be 20 minutes, so I'm hoping to compromise on 15. Is that okay? Okay. All right. Okay. Baseline measurements. A huge question which seems to come up in your literature is, what are the characteristics of the patient that allow me to accurately prognosticate or select the best surgical approach? That seems to be sort of a key question. In order to design any study to address that, you need to measure in an unambiguous way what those patient characteristics were before you did anything to them. Okay? So these are true baseline characteristics like smoking, diabetes, etc. And the reason I emphasize that before you did anything to them is because at least some of your literature confuses baseline predictors of outcome and treatment-related process outcomes. So let me give you an example. So there seems to be something, help me out here. There's, when you're doing your root canal, perforation is a bad thing? Okay, I don't mean to be funny here. Okay. But that's the equivalent of someone asking me, is losing the pulse a bad thing? Is that the equivalent? Okay, so just real quickly, what is perforation? What are you perforating? So this is a hole through the wall, the lateral wall of a root, as opposed to where there's supposed to be a hole? Okay, thank you. So perforation is a bad thing. So there's this pattern in your literature of listing predictors of outcome and, smoking, diabetes, age, selection of various disinfecting agents, okay? And then there's somewhere that then there has perforation, as if that's a predictor. Well, I don't think you go up to someone and say, I'm worried you're not going to have a good outcome because I'm going to perforate your root, right? You don't do that. Perforation is something that occurs after the initiation of treatment. It is a proximal outcome. It is not a predictor. Now, yes, sir.
Point of clarity.
Yeah.
Because we're referral based, it may be what the patient presents to us with.
Oh, okay, all right. I'm sorry. The way I was reading this, it's because they talk about perforation as being, oh, that's interesting. I was interpreting this, this is from the British study. I was interpreting it as being something that occurred during the procedure. Is that not true?
It would be something that their general dentist did, had that outcome, aborted, and then sent it to us.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Okay, so if that's the case, then everything I said is completely wrong. Okay. Thank you, and I appreciate that. Digging myself. Okay, so, but what about, there's something about there being the flap that gets inflamed afterwards? That's an outcome of your procedure, right? What does possibly mean? What do you mean? It's something that happens after you complete your procedure. Flare-up, thank you. Oh, okay, now it's obvious. So what is a flare-up?
You don't get that as a predictor.
Okay, then why would you include it in a model where you're trying?
It's not a predictor. It's a result.
So how is it so obvious to you, and in this publication it's listed right along with, okay? Yes, sir.
I think that perforation or even a separate bias incident might happen during the treatment, even among endodontists. So it happened, these two should be excluded of the sample of the research, right? Should not be part of the pool of the...
Okay.
Something happened during the treatment.
So there's two parts to what you're saying, okay? And so the first part is, obviously I'm not sure in this trial whether the perforation line I was looking at was during the current procedure or was a baseline presentation after a therapeutic misadventure, okay? If it was in a prior procedure and it was a therapeutic misadventure, you guys don't use that term? We use that all the time, okay, all right. It's just...
Roger, in the paper you looked at,
you're trying to say it's a picture of some element of failure, having had the name on the doctor who did the root canal.
The prior one or?
Not prior, no.
Okay, so then I'm right. It's not a baseline. Okay.
I didn't know the paper.
Okay.
It's Paulus and tissues.
So there's two parts to what you're saying. So the first is, if the perforation occurs during the procedure whose outcomes we are trying to predict, then the perforation is approximate outcome. It is not a predictor. And I'm going to get into, after the break, I'm going to get into why that is so important. It's not a matter of semantics. It's a matter of getting the right answer versus getting the wrong answer. Okay? If a perforation occurs, you have to keep that tooth in the treatment group to which it was originally assigned. Otherwise, you bias the results of the study and you get the wrong answer. And that's something called the intention to treat principle. So one of the reasons the consort diagram is so important is because it forces you to never exclude anybody from your final analysis without it being clear why. And you can't exclude it for that reason. Now think about, think about the mechanism by which something like diabetes or smoking might affect endodontal outcomes. So, well, help me out here. Is there any known risk factor that changes the amount of bone in the root, the thickness of the root? Okay, so much for that example. So,
The age of the tooth, maybe you've got to...
does it thin over time? Thickens. Okay, well, I'm going to have to make this up because we can't spend all day with me trying to learn endodontics. So let's suppose you have a risk factor and it affects how easy it is to perforate the tooth. Okay. Okay, so maybe the degree of calcification or something, it's a risk factor, okay? If you exclude the teeth that are perforated, you're going to exclude preferentially patients with that risk factor. They all have a bad-ish outcome, I gather. That's going to make it look like that risk factor is protective because now none of those bad outcomes are counted. You get the wrong answer, okay? It's bad to fail to identify a treatment effect that really works. It's really bad to get it absolutely backwards, right? Okay, so a basic principle in trial design is that when a patient is randomized to a trial, or in observational studies, whenever a patient is initially enrolled, you keep them in the group defined by their baseline characteristics or treatment assignment, regardless of what happens to them. Okay? So if you have two different antibiotics that you're considering, and they get randomized to antibiotic A, and the next week they come back popping antibiotic B that they stole from their girlfriend, okay? They're counted in group A. That's called the intention to treat principle, and it ensures that you get an accurate estimate of the impact of the choice of choosing antibiotic A over antibiotic B. Okay. So in terms of baseline measurements, you want to have the baselines be true baselines. I think we spent quite a bit on that. You want the categories to be pre-specified and unambiguous. So you can't just say smoking, yes, no. You have to say how long, how recently, reported by who, so that everybody can apply those inclusion and exclusion criteria or the baseline characteristics the same way. And if it's going to be an important baseline characteristic, like a interpretation of a radiograph, say you're looking at the impact of different root patterns on ability to do something. I gather it's unusual to have 6 roots. I found that in a little case report somewhere. Okay, but you're counting roots or something like that. You want to be able to know that there's good inter-rater reliability in assessing that baseline characteristics. So inter-rater means different people will look at the radiograph and make the same decision or categorization. Reliability means they do the same thing each time. Doesn't mean either of them are right. It means that they do the same thing each time they look at it. Okay, so that's it on baseline measurements. Randomization and interventions. So one of the things that I noticed is that at least the papers that were presented to me were observational studies where the goal was to try to use data in which you had just let clinicians do what essentially they wanted to do with some minor controls, and then follow the patients to their outcomes and try to figure out what made a difference. So the first comment I want to make is an observational study cannot establish causality. They can hint at the beneficial effects or lack thereof, but they cannot unambiguously establish the causality. Only an interventional design can do that. So that's a fundamental issue, especially given both the uncertainty that you demonstrate with respect to what you think really makes a difference, and it's not you personally, it's what's in your literature, and because of the fact that there's likely to be unknown effect predictors of outcome that are not measured or reported and may be correlated with the choices that the clinician uses. Okay, so you believe that this patient is higher or lower risk, you adjust, the number of treatment sessions or the other things, and it's really hard to sort that out. So if one wants to be able to really say, making this decision therapeutically causes this change in the probability of a good outcome, you have to do interventions and you have to randomize. So during one of the breaks earlier in the morning, someone raised a question about the ethics of randomization. So first I want to talk about the purpose, and then I want to talk about the ethics. The purpose of randomization is to create two or more groups of subjects who are as similar as possible to each other with respect to characteristics that are important but that you do not know about. So it's to create populations that are similar to each other with respect to variables that you cannot anticipate, define, or measure. See, if you knew a variable was important, if you knew gender was important or age was important, you could do what's called purposive sampling, where you purposely put people into particular groups to make sure those characteristics are balanced, and you get perfect balance over time. The challenge is when you don't know what makes the difference. And do you guys talk about good protoplasm, bad protoplasm? Okay. That's a huge issue in my area. It's sort of a quasi-religious discussion of what you think. It basically means there are things that affect outcome that you can't really define, measure, or affect. So you want whatever those good or bad protoplasm things are to be well balanced so that when you see a difference in outcome between the groups, you can attribute, in a causal sense, those differences in outcome to the difference in treatment that were given because the patients were in different randomized groups. Okay. I would submit to you that doing clinical research that cannot establish the benefit of a treatment over a standard of care is, in some sense, unethical because it puts the patient it puts burden on the patients without the potential of either individual benefit or benefit to the class of future patients that you treat within your profession. Okay? So what is considered the ethics of randomization? So first of all, randomization takes the choice of treatment out of the patient's control and out of your control. For it to be ethical, you have to honestly believe that either of the treatment arms or any of the treatment arms, if there's more than two, are in fact reasonable, community standard, or better treatments for the disease that your patient has. Okay? So it doesn't make sense to have one of your control arms be something that was the standard of care 20 years ago. Okay? I get the impression from discussions that most of you believe that operating under a microscope is better than not. Is that fair? Okay? So you wouldn't want, as an individual decision, you wouldn't want to participate in a randomized trial where one of the arms was not use of the microscope. Okay? You might think it's of benefit to the class of patients to unambiguously identify that as being an important predictor of outcome. But you might want, it would be unethical if you believe there was that approach to treatment was no longer within the standard of care, at least within your community. Okay? So someone, and I'm going to put, I don't see them right now, but does anybody have a question or comment about the ethics of, or was it you? Yeah, okay, now I do see you. Okay, now I've pointed you out, which is even better. Okay. So you said that you have been told that it would be unethical to randomize patients within endodontal studies. And I was, okay. So the idea is that if you had a strong preconceived, I'm putting words in your mouth and I know that if you had a strong preconceived notion that one treatment was better than the other, then it wouldn't be ethical. Is that a summary of it? Okay. Okay. Okay, so there's a great example. I'm going to digress for a second. So when we sew up lacerations in the emergency department, what do we irrigate with? Anybody know? Okay, very good. Tap water. Okay. Why do we irrigate wounds that we're going to close with tap water? It's chlorinated. Wow, okay. How about a more sort of epidemiologic explanation as opposed to a mechanistic one? It makes no difference. It turns out that we did not evolve in a world where every time you got cut, someone came along with sterile fluid and irrigated out your wound under high force. Most of us have a level of immune competence that makes it so that you can have some bacterial load in a closed wound and it won't pus out. Okay? All you have to do to have uniformly good clinical outcomes for a usual fresh wound in a well-vascularized area in a non-diabetic is to get the bacterial count below that level. And you can use sterile saline. You can use tap water. You could probably use Diet Coke. Okay, I'm not recommending that. Okay, it doesn't matter because it's really the force and the volume that gets you down. And then you have uniform out. So it just doesn't matter. I, in fact, use normal saline. The tap water in our hospital I wouldn't want to trust. I don't think it's equivalent to the tap water used in those other studies. But in fact, you can use tap water. And it's been demonstrated to make no difference. Okay? So when you said I wouldn't want to use tap water, that's what struck me. So in order to have randomization be ethical, you have to have what's called a state of equipoise. So the term equipoise refers to a state of therapeutic indifference where a reasonable set of informed clinicians working in your community and with your patient population would demonstrate substantial variability in the treatment selection. Now, what I didn't say is that you as an individual had to have no preference. Okay? If we had to require, from an ethical point of view, that an individual doctors all had to believe it was totally a toss-up, we'd never get any research done because doctors are wonderful at having a strong opinion in a complete absence of evidence, data, or information. Okay? So what you need is to have it be clear that in the community, people receiving standard care would naturally receive different treatments because of the variability in the community. Now, if you're studying a new drug or a new device or a new therapy or a new surgical procedure that's not in the community, then it has to be that reasonable people looking at both options would say, I don't know which one is likely to be better. So that's the state of equipoise. It is sometimes misstated as a requirement that an individual physician cannot choose. That is not true, and that would be an unworkable definition. Now, there's a fascinating process that happens during a clinical trial, which is that as data start to accumulate, one naturally loses a state of equipoise. And there is a point in a clinical trial, if one of the treatments really is performing better than another, where most people, if they looked at the data, would say, wow, I'd really much rather have treatment B than treatment A. But before the data are so unequivocal to reach statistical significance or the pre-specified criteria for terminating the trial. And that is something that is naturally uncomfortable to people because there's a point where you wouldn't want to be randomized, but as a scientific body, community, or profession, we believe we need to continue randomization in order to unambiguously answer the question. The ethical support for that behavior is a little more tenuous in my mind, but it is based on this idea that unless we demonstrate the improvement of a new treatment over the standard treatment with some level of assuredness, we will not change future clinical practice and future patients will not benefit from those scientific advances. If you fail to do randomization or you terminate a trial so early that many people aren't convinced, most future patients will receive the inferior treatment, which was the standard of care, because they won't believe you really demonstrated the new one is better. Okay? So there is some sort of tension between individual benefit within the trial and the benefit to the class of patients who are going to be treated in the future. One of the purposes of response adaptive randomization, as I talked about in the adaptive trial design piece, was to partially address the dual desire of improving the chance of a good outcome within the trial and at the same time getting scientifically rigorous results so that future patients benefit from the sacrifices that the patients within the trial made in allowing themselves to be randomized. There's an editorial in JAMA from earlier in this year that a guy named Will Moyer, Don Berry, and I wrote about the ethical issue of randomization and response adaptive randomization, if you're interested. Okay. So does that address your concern? Or? Okay, okay. Now, one of the interesting things has to do with patients' understanding of randomization. Has anybody here consented a patient for participation in a trial in which therapies were randomized? You have? Oh, okay, several of you have. Okay. How did the conversation go?
Terrible. It was hard.
It was terrible.
Terrible.
Okay. It was hard and it was terrible. I'm not sure who to start with. Okay, we'll start with terrible.
The patient said, well, if it was you, what would you want? What would you want then? 1 or 2 visits? Very difficult question to answer.
So what did you say? That is really not the behavior I wanted to illustrate. Okay, okay.
The point I made is the reason we're doing the randomization is we don't know. And naturally I was true for the patient. As I said, my bias is that 2 visits is better, but I may very well be wrong.
Okay.
That was hard.
Yeah, okay.
This was a drug study, and I had to give patients drugs that I had absolutely no idea what I was giving them, and I had to explain that to them, and there could be a side effect, there could be a problem if there is, and it was hard.
Mm-hmm. So you had no idea, or you just didn't know which arm they would be assigned to? You did know which drugs were included as possibilities. You did? Okay, okay. Because as a general rule, you're consenting a patient to a randomized study. You have to describe all of the treatments that they might receive. Right. Okay, okay. So several things. First of all, it is a very difficult conversation because patients naturally assume their doctor knows best, and therefore it really does know what the best treatment is, and for some reason just isn't telling them. Okay, right? They sort of assumed you knew. Now, I think it is perfectly reasonable to say, well, if you weren't in the trial, you know, I would probably do this, but it's really not based on anything, which is almost always the truth. And it's best if you can honestly say, I have no idea which is better. It turns out that if you have that conversation and they repeat that back to you and they sign the consent form, then if you, as they're walking out of the office, someone who doesn't look like they work for you asks them, what did they just sign? They have no idea. It is one of the most disturbing sort of ethical pieces of research. They really don't understand that the purpose of a randomized trial is to figure out what the better treatment is. It is not to assign the better treatment to them. They continue to have what's called the therapeutic misconception, which is the belief that the goal of the clinical research is to maximize their own personal outcome. Okay? It is only ethical to allow, since we know people don't really understand it, it's only ethical if we honestly believe it really doesn't put them at greater risk of a bad outcome. It's not that nothing bad's going to happen. My specialty, bad stuff happens all the time, much more than yours, I hope. Okay? But as long as I know that they're agreeing to participate doesn't increase the chance of a bad thing happening, then I think it's okay. There was a question or comment in the back. So the question is it ethical to use a placebo in an analgesia trial? So if the procedure is one in which analgesia is routinely given, then I cannot see any argument for it being ethical, meaning I don't think it's ethical, to have an arm in which there is not at least the community standard of care with respect to analgesia.
So we couldn't get some of the studies that we had 15, 20 years ago performed now?
Oh, I hope not, yes. Okay. So how can you do that? Let's suppose, for example, you have an an effective analgesic agent. So it's my specialty. Let's say it's IV morphine. Great drug, no question it works, okay? It's also very inexpensive and safe. It's almost hard to picture a better analgesic. I'm not just advertising for morphine. But the thing that's amazing about morphine is the number of physicians who believe it is dangerous or unsafe or highly addictive in intermittent pain, which is just not borne out by the evidence, okay? But there's a lot of prejudice against it. So if you're evaluating a new therapy in a setting in which IV morphine is the standard care, say fracture reduction, okay? Instead of designing a trial to demonstrate that the new one is better than control, or than placebo, which would not be ethical, what you do is you design a trial whose goal is to demonstrate that the new therapy is not inferior to morphine. So it's a non-inferiority study. Huge. It's a whole nother lecture on how a non-inferiority design works and how the null and alternative hypotheses and setup. It's not, you don't want to hear it, trust me. Okay, but just be aware that if the clinical setting is one that there is a standard approach that you believe is effective, okay, or at least somewhat effective, then the right design is a non-inferiority design against that, assuming the new therapy being evaluated has some other advantage. So if you believe, for example, IV morphine carries with it the risk of respiratory depression in the doses and the setting that you're using it, and you had a new drug that you thought would be as effective from an analgesia point of view but not have the side effects, then a positive non-inferiority study would allow you to state that the analgesia was equivalent and that if there was lower observed rate of respiratory depression, then you could say it was clinically superior because it avoided the risk of the respiratory depression. Okay, is that, okay. Other questions, comments on this? Yes. I think I get the point. So whether or not there's clinical equipoise may depend on the state of the patient. So for example, you can picture a hospice situation where the respiratory depression is not an issue and there's no benefit to avoiding the respiratory depression, and therefore you might not have equipoise. So there maybe you can't ethically randomize to a drug that you know is not going to be better in analgesia and only avoids a side effect that's not of concern. So the settings are different in terms of the expected outcome, but the expected outcome is part of the baseline disease process. The basic concept, which is you need to have therapeutic equipoise, is the same. Now there are settings where, for example, I've seen designs in which, because there's such a big placebo response, headache trials are like this, some antidepressant trials are like this, that they have a period of a placebo treatment, but everybody, where you're either on placebo or active, but then everybody gets an active treatment for much longer. This is actually pretty common in depression trials. But when they do that, they have to do much closer monitoring for suicide risk during the washout period of the antidepressant, and they have to have, spacing out on the name, you have to have an option for immediately crossing over into an active arm if you decompensate clinically. So there are ways of doing it, but you have to build in additional protections. But I think that's a little far away from endodontal disease, I hope. Okay. All right. So one of the things that came up earlier this morning had to do with interventions where what you do is really complicated. I'm sorry? So I think there's several different parts to what you're saying. There is a generally observed fact that trials that are industry sponsored are more likely to have a positive outcome than trials that are not.
Every single of them.
That's not the generally observed pattern. It's
100%.
Yes, so it would suggest a remarkable degree of selection of the 193 studies that they chose to talk about. Well, first of all, I haven't talked about blinding yet, so you're a little bit ahead. Okay. So there's a little bit off topic, a little bit out of order, but there is a substantial amount of empirical evidence that there is bias, positive bias in clinical research that is associated with industry sponsorship and especially with poorer methodologic design. So the things that I've been talking about, like need for pre-specification, identification of subgroups, clear entry criteria, clear point at which patients are enrolled, and accounting for all patients enrolled in the trial, are all parts of a general strategy to improve the validity, either the internal or both the internal and the external validity of the trial. The observation is that when trials lack that kind of methodologic rigor, the bias is towards a positive result. Okay, that's an empiric fact. That's why, for example, in regulatory settings, they require all of those things to help protect against false positive results. I'm not familiar with the paper that you've given. There are some remarkable groups of studies that people have shown there was systematic, if you will, censoring in the way the results were presented to make things that were really negative look positive. Let me give you an example. The original clinical trial design defines a particular outcome. Okay, maybe the particular outcome is tooth survival at 5 years. And as they're looking at the data, they find out it didn't actually improve tooth survival at 5 years, but wow, the radiographic appearance of the apices was a lot better at 3 years. And suddenly the publication is submitted as if that was the primary outcome. Okay? So that's a very, very common strategy that, you know, there's some evil in the world. Okay? Sorry. But there are also many people who confuse their own desire for a positive result with the right thing to do. Now, maybe it's ignorance. I'm not sure what it is, okay? Self-delusion. And so, I mean, I've talked to people, I've had interactions with authors where I say, but, you know, I looked up on clinicaltrials.gov and this wasn't the primary outcome. And I get an answer back, oh, yes, that one didn't show anything, but this one did. And as if that was okay. So I don't know if it's ignorance or I'm not sure what it is. Okay, so there's clearly bias associated with that. What I'm hoping to do in my discussion this afternoon is emphasize those things that reduce the magnitude of those bias and give you a greater, but not perfect, level of assurance that the results that you get at the end of a trial will truly reflect the impact of choosing a particular approach to endodontal treatment versus another one. Okay? All right. Okay. Now I do want to talk about interventions. So what you do is complicated in the sense that there's many, many different steps you can take in matching your treatment approach to a patient characteristics, like the choice for one versus multiple visits. I'm sure there's approaches about the actual, you know, endodontal technique or surgical approach. And you probably all have slightly different sort of decisions about this. And I was warned that if I asked you what makes a difference in outcome, you guys would all start fighting over the answers to this question. Okay. So how is it that as a strategy, as a specialty, you can start to generate the kind of evidence that informs these decisions and makes it evidence-based? And it seems to me that you're never going to be able to do it by trying to do studies that look at each individual decision as an isolation thing. So you may have two different agents that you use for disinfecting the canal. Are you going to do one randomized study for that and one randomized study for different little tools you use and one randomized study for this brand of microscope versus that? I mean, I doubt you're going to be able to get enthusiasm for doing each of those. And even if you do it, no one will know if this agent is better in this setting and this tool was better in that setting, that it means that when you put them together, the results are additive or rule out. Maybe they both address the same issue and whichever one you use is fine and you don't need both. It's very hard to know. What you have to be able to do is to think not in terms of treatments, but in terms of strategies or algorithms. And if I were, you know, I don't know if you have a society that has a research committee.
Don't make everybody laugh. Don't even go there.
If one was in a setting where you had a society with a research committee, what that research committee ought to do is ask the question, where is the major uncertainty regarding the strategies you use in matching treatment to patient characteristics? And try to identify a handful of those strategies, okay? And and I don't know enough about, I don't know anything actually about your profession, but I certainly don't know enough to try to even come up with examples of what those might be. And those should be very carefully thought out discussions. Now, let me tell you what I mean by strategy. A strategy is not just, I'm going to use this tool and this agent and do it in 2 visits and something like that. It's, I'm going to do that, and then if this goes wrong, I'm going to do this. It's laying out the whole treatment algorithm so that I can know that 2 of you in geographically disparate locations can follow the same map in deciding the therapy for a given patient randomized to that strategy. So you're reducing practice variation within the process of all of the decision making you do during the preoperative and the process of doing your procedure. Okay? Because then you can design trials that compare strategies. And once you know among various strategies which one seems to be the best, or maybe which one is the best in the smoker diabetics, and the fact that it doesn't matter in the others, then you have something you can go after scientifically and ask, okay, let's see if we can figure out why that one is the best. Okay? So let me give you an example from my world. So in the treatment of sepsis, with this disease of overwhelming infection with this 40% mortality, there were failed study after failed study after failed study looking at just types of fluids you used, or types of antibiotics, or timing of vasoactive drugs that are used. And a guy named Manny Rivers said, well, I'm sorry?
When you say failed study, you mean no difference?
Yeah, I mean failed study. So either no apparent difference or uninterpretable. A little bit of a difference, but then such imbalance between the groups and other things that you just had no idea whether it was a fluke or not. Okay? So a guy named Manny Rivers did a study where he said, okay, I'm going to use what I understand about physiology and come up with a treatment algorithm. It's not you're going to do this, 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 and this. It's it's called goal-directed therapy, early goal-directed therapy. But I'm going to first do this, and then if this happens, I'm going to do this. If that happens, I'm not going to not do that. I'm going to do this other thing. It's a roadmap for how to resuscitate and treat these patients. And he compared following that roadmap to just the doctor doing what they normally did, or what we call a wild-type control. And although there's some controversy over the magnitude of the treatment effect that was observed, there was a remarkably improved long-term survival in the patients who were treated according to this roadmap. That then leads naturally to the development of trials to look at the components of it and try to figure out what of that whole roadmap makes a difference. But now at least you know where you're looking, right? Okay? Now if there had been no effect of that roadmap, then you could say, okay, well that wasn't a good approach, let's come up with a whole different way of thinking about it. Okay? So I would encourage you to think about whether or not you can define as a group what the major controversies are in sort of approach or philosophy or decision-making algorithm, to define a relatively small number of approaches that could be compared because there's true equipoise, and could be compared because a large enough number of reasonable endodontists would be willing to follow any one of those algorithms to which an individual patient was randomized. Because then you're going to be in a position to actually conclude things about cause and effect. Okay. Now, I mentioned earlier the intention to treat principle. So this is this idea that if you randomize a patient to a treatment, no matter what happens, they continue to be counted as a member of that treatment group. And that's because you're categorizing people according to the intention of what you're going to do. I intend to treat you this way, as opposed to the way I actually ended up treating you. Let me give you an example. So there was a period a while back, it's quite a while back, where there was controversy whether or not when a patient came in with a myocardial infarction, with a heart attack, it was better to send them to the cardiac catheterization lab where they would use the balloon and the wire and try to open up the vessel, versus giving them one of the clot buster drugs. It was TPA at the time. Okay? And the advantage of TPA was you didn't have to wait for a cardiologist. There's no cardiologist in the room either, right? Okay. Didn't have to wait for a cardiologist to get, it was always seemed to be his ass out of bed, to come in. You could just give the clot busting drug, so your time to treatment was much better. On the other hand, there was some evidence that your chance of getting the blood vessel open and restoring flow to the threatened myocardium was better with the mechanical therapy. Okay? Very important studies were done in this. And I was giving a lecture, Medicine Grand Rounds at my institution, on a whole lecture that you're being saved from on the intention to treat principle and why it was important. And I made the point that if a patient came in with a myocardial infarction and they were randomized to the catheterization laboratory approach, and they died right after that coin was flipped, but before the cardiologist could get into the hospital, that death had to be counted against the cardiac catheterization arm. That's the intention to treat, even though they were never catheterized. Okay? And in front of me in that chair was the director of the cath lab, who, I kid you not, stood up and said, basically, how the hell does that make any sense? The language was more colorful. How the hell does that make any sense? How can you count that death against me? I didn't even touch the patient. And the answer is because the patient died waiting for you to get your you-know-what out of bed. Okay? So this is critically important because the purpose of the clinical research is to inform the decision of what your strategy is for treating the patient. And part of the outcome of the cardiac cath lab approach is associated with the delays in getting the patient to the cath lab and getting the cardiologist there at the same time, right? Okay, that's part of the real effect. And if you're in a rural area where that's a 3-hour delay, because it's helicoptering to a different hospital, there may be a completely different balance of risk versus benefit than if you're in an urban treatment center where my cardiologist is asleep upstairs, which is now the rule because it took him so long to get in, okay, and therefore come down relatively quickly. Okay? So look for this when you read randomized studies that patients are included in the group to which they were originally randomized, regardless of what endodontal approach was ultimately used on the patient. Okay? Yes?
What if the patient was crossed over, you know, let's say they failed to respond to the first one, they were acute, you go in and surgically manage it instead of, you know, medically manage it, and now all of a sudden, you count it as a failure of the first management? Or of the original intention?
Okay. So you don't change the definition of failure. I think, yeah, I haven't gotten to outcomes yet. But let's say your outcome is tooth survival. Okay, I'm just going to make something up. So the patient gets randomized to, see if I get this right, orthograde treatment. Okay? They fail that, and now you have to do the little thing where you cut down to the root and do the retrograde thingy. Okay? Thank you. Okay, was working on that all night. Okay, okay, okay. So your intent was to randomize the patient to the orthograde treatment. Their outcome, their 5-year tooth survival, gets tied to the orthograde treatment because that was your intent. The fact that the crossover is an available part of that arm is part of the effectiveness of the first treatment. It's really counterintuitive. But the reason this is important is because the purpose of the research is to tell you how to make that first decision. Okay? And whether you should make that first decision that way is partially dependent on whether you have the option for the crossover in case the first one doesn't work. Okay? So it's almost a universal truth that the patients stay in the treatment to which they are originally assigned regardless of whether they ever get that treatment or they cross over. Okay? All right.
So it's not a test of the treatment, it's a test of the algorithm. Decision. It's a test of the algorithm.
So there is no such thing as a treatment. Okay? I don't know about you. Do you successfully do everything you intend to do? Okay. What we're trying to do is inform the intent or the decision. Okay. So the example I give for residents are procedures. I intend to place an endotracheal tube in your trachea so I can oxygenate. Luckily, most of the time that's what happens, but sometimes it doesn't. And the effectiveness and the decision should be based on incorporating the possibility that it won't happen as well. Okay. All the same thing. Yes?
So in a drug study, you have, say, 2 groups, and you know that the patient did not take the drug in group A, you still include them in group A?
Yep. Doesn't this bother you? Okay, doesn't it bother you? He doesn't seem to be bothered. But yes, if this doesn't bother you, you're not listening so I guess you're not listening. Okay, so to give you another example. Do you guys ever use a drug, dicloxacillin? Anybody remember this drug? Okay, so dicloxacillin is an anti-staph drug. It's a really good anti-staph drug. Not for MRSA, but for staph before MRSA was a big problem. And what I mean by really good is that if you had a colony of staph growing in a petri dish and a little disc with dicloxacillin in it, the staph would die. Okay? And if you put dicloxacillin in a pill, it worked really, really well. Okay? But there used to be this stuff called pediatric dicloxacillin suspension, which was the most foul-tasting stuff that man has ever created. Okay? And so people would occasionally write this as a prescription for a child, a toddler, okay, who had a staph infection, and it just doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is it's like, you guys read the internet cartoon or internet sort of diatribe about how you give a pill to a cat? Okay. Oh, guys, if you guys don't know this, how many people have cats? All right, well, those of you who have cats, look up how to give a pill to a cat. The gist of it is that you're more likely to end up swallowing the pill than the cat. Giving dicloxacillin syrup to a toddler is exactly the same. It ends up on the parent, on the wall, but the one place it never ends up is in the bloodstream of the child. Okay? So the effectiveness of dicloxacillin is lower than you would think because there is a lack of an ability to give it. And therefore, you shouldn't prescribe it because it won't work, but it has nothing to do with how well the drug works. And if you counted only the comatose toddlers in whom you could actually give it, you would inappropriately conclude that it was a highly effective drug, and you get the wrong answer. Okay? So I have actually, if we have time and you're still interested in this, I have a whole set of slides on this, but I can show you if you count it by what treatment if you include in the treatment groups only those patients in whom you could successfully administer the therapy, you get the wrong answer, and you can even get a backwards answer, which makes something look like it works better when it works worse. Okay? Okay. Outcome assessment. So the difference between process outcomes and patient-centered outcomes. So what is a process outcome? Anybody have? A process is something you do, okay? It doesn't matter to the patient in general, okay? People love process outcomes. Actually, I didn't see a lot of this in the papers that I saw. In one of the parts of the world I work in, which is pre-hospital care, we love process outcomes. We measure how long it took the paramedics to get there, how fast they drove, where they parked, how long it took them to, just ridiculous stuff. Nothing that has to do with how well the patient may have died, but damn, we got there fast. Okay? It's process outcome. Then there are disease-specific outcomes or sort of physician-specific outcomes. And your enamorment, or apparent enamorment, I don't even know if that's a word, with the radiologic appearance of the periapical area, to me, is a disease-specific outcome that's of little or no interest to the patient whatsoever. Because I don't know, does any patient ever come in and say, I feel like there might be a radiographic lucency here. Okay, I'm not sure. Okay? They don't do that, right? They come in when there's a functional impairment. Or they are worried because they lose the tooth or it gets pulled or it falls out or something. Okay? So we should design clinical research around patient-centered outcomes. Now, those other outcomes may be very useful in understanding why things happen to the patient. Why does the tooth fall out? Okay? Maybe that is related to a disease process that we can intervene in, or we can identify things that allow us to prognosticate more accurately. Wow, it looks like you're not getting the healing radiographically I would have hoped for. It's more likely you won't be able to keep that tooth. Okay? But what we shouldn't do is design studies as if the patients care about radiographic lucency. Okay? So we should focus on patient-centered outcomes like tooth survival, need for replacement, that kind of thing. Okay. Now, any comments on that? Questions on that? Okay, how about for this? Why is it that you guys have studies that look at this apical radiographic changes as an outcome? Okay, so it's a proxy for success, it's correlated with pain.
And by that stage, we change our whole profession. Just by saying that, we can't use radiolucent indications on the radiograph as some measure of success, literally changes what we do. Because we
And that's a bad thing.
Well, you don't mind.
The argument of regeneration versus repair, we like to say, well, actually, cause regeneration of original tissues, kind of internally for ourselves, we like to think, well, that would be the ideal.
So who are we treating?
The tooth.
So you have to know that this psychological need to have personal effectiveness, independent of what's perceived by the patient, is shared by all healthcare professions. Okay? I can come up with lots of examples where in my particular specialty, we did the same thing for years, and some people only gave up the outcome measures they cared about when they died. The physician died. Okay? Okay. Yes?
I think one of the issues here, maybe you can elucidate, is we suffer from this base rate error. In other words, we see a skewed population of patients that come to us with a problem. We take a radiograph and there's a periapical radiolucency there. So we associate that with patients who have problems. We don't see all of the patients walking around with periapical radiolucencies that never had a problem. So our base rate error is high here. We call it a heuristic. We see a population of patients where we associate this periapical radiolucency with disease without seeing the millions of patients that have periapical radiolucencies and never have any problem with neuropathy.
So, yeah, no, it makes sense. I'm trying to figure out how to address it. So is it true, though, that patients without the lucency rarely have symptoms? Or is that not true? Not true. So why do you pay attention to it at all? You told me I lost you. Okay, all right. So
we're awakened at 3 o'clock every weekend with patients that are in pain. We have to come in and we take a radiograph. There's a periapical radiolucency.
So what do you do if you get the same phone call, you come in, you're just as tired and irritable, and you take the x-ray and there's no lucency, but the patient's in pain? It's a different diagnosis, okay? And then why is it important? We're getting somewhere now. Okay, why is it a different diagnosis, or what implications does that have for the appropriate therapy?
It's a different stage of disease.
So do you treat it differently? Okay, so this is disturbing actually, but it's. I am so glad I did this after my wife came back from the endodontist. Okay, because I was able to be all supportive and enthusiastic about the treatment at the time. I'm not. Believe me, she'll say, "Where were you?" I was at SeaWorld. Okay, so all right, we're confusing several things here, and I've allowed that to happen because this is just fascinating. But I think I'm here actually for your benefit, not you for mine. So the first thing is, we're talking about outcomes, okay? You're talking about disease stratification variables. So for example, one of your studies clearly shows, pretty clearly shows, that the presence at baseline of the lucency versus no lucency is associated with a lower chance of tooth survival, which is a patient-centered outcome. And then among those patients who have some lucency identified, it said that the size of the lucency, meaning the larger the lucency, is associated with a greater chance of larger lucency, lower probability of tooth survival. Okay, so I think there's empirical evidence that as a baseline variable, it affects the risk of survival of the tooth. You agree with that? Okay, so that does not make it an outcome. That makes it a baseline stratification. Just like smoking may affect the probability of tooth survival, But it doesn't mean that a week later you ask them if they're smoking, and if they're still smoking, that's something, you weren't trying to affect smoking, right? Okay. So this is what I'm trying to strive for here, is with maybe minimal success, is this idea that your value to the patients and the value of your specialty to your patients needs to be based on things that patients can perceive as being an expected benefit of the therapy if it's successful. And I don't want to make comments about comparative effectiveness research and healthcare reform and all those things, but you should be worried if you continually have studies that show that you make x-rays look better, but the teeth fall out just as much or hurt just as much. I'm not saying they do, but I'm just saying you should be worried. So you instead should design your future studies so that the primary outcomes are things that the patients care about, people are willing to pay for in terms of the benefit. And these things that help you understand baseline risk or the process of disease that leads to those outcomes as a scientific endeavor, those are things you should continue to collect, but don't confuse them with outcomes. Okay, that's the piece I'm making. And in terms of the comment about me totally changing your profession, yes, that's my response, sorry. Okay.
I think you kind of hit on the spot there, that this is our problem. We have
You're not using the benefit of our specialty. But it's been in the opposite direction, where the patient's asymptomatic, but it shows that the lesion's gotten bigger. So we get all, we got to go in there and do something, but the patient was completely clueless that this was going on.
So one of the things that you ought to think about in your definition of treatment strategies that you want to compare is the strategy of whether you do something when an asymptomatic patient generates radiographic deterioration. Because what an obvious thing for there being uncertainty if the patient's asymptomatic. Now, maybe what you're doing is absolutely right, that if the patients just they don't perceive it, and if you let it go, you have a worse outcome, because we know a larger lucency is associated with a lower chance of tooth survival once you do intervene. So maybe you shouldn't just let it grow. But it may be that when it's asymptomatic, that's a completely different population, because these studies seem to be done in patients who are symptomatic, right? Okay, I have no idea what population these studies are done, but that seems like a really good question to think about. Okay? All right, any other?
I just have a question. From a medical standpoint then, how does that differ from doing mammographies to intercept small breast cancer lesions, or colonoscopies and going in and seeing polyps you don't know that are malignant, but you take them out anyway? How do you justify that versus us seeing those nasal lesions as highly suspicious of having endodontic origin?
Okay, that's great. It's a great question. So if you look at the literature, and first of all, disclaimer, I am not an expert in this. Unfortunately for you, Steve Goodman really is an expert in the issue of mammography, but he's gone, okay. But I can answer the general question. There was a period in the development of the evidential base for those screenings in which there were sort of circumstantial evidence of benefit. So there was this idea that if you do mammography, and by the way, the population of women 40 to 50 who do not have an unusually high risk profile for breast cancer, so there's not breast cancer in a first relative, is the population where there was tremendous controversy over the benefits of mammography. Okay, and part of the reason, just so you know, that this was, in my opinion only, the reason this, I think, was so controversial is because of the amount of money associated with mammography and the tremendous political clout of the American Cancer Society and the financial clout of the Society of Radiologists, American College of Radiology. Okay? Big money at stake. So there was, for example, evidence that when you did mammography early, you tended to catch cancer at an earlier stage. There was sort of evidence that the survival tended to be longer, okay? But we're going to talk about the Will Rogers effect, which is a really important thing to know about. In colon cancer, there was evidence that if you did colonoscopy, you found these premalignant lesions that we thought we understood tended to go on to cancer, but we weren't sure. But it really wasn't accepted as standard of care until there was data that showed that those procedures, when applied in a randomized fashion, resulted in reduced all-cause mortality. Okay? So the comment I was making about you have to be willing to intervene and randomize and use a patient-centered outcome to demonstrate an effect is exactly the criteria that was applied to those interventions. Now, for women 50 and above with a normal risk factor, it's absolutely clear that mammography reduces all-cause mortality and breast cancer-specific mortality. Okay? It's just the lower age groups where it's unclear. And then similarly, the recommendations for colonoscopy, screening colonoscopy, also show a clear decrease in risk of all-cause mortality. The place where there's uncertainty has to do with once you've had a negative screen, I'm going to talk about colonoscopy for a second, exactly how frequent your recurrent screening has to be, right? There's whether, you know, every 5 years, every 10 years, that I think the data are less clear, but this is the fine point. This is the whole point about wanting to do an interventional study that shows you that you have a benefit in something, and then having the next generation of your research program try to understand what are the details of it that are yielding that benefit. But if you don't do the first thing, you don't get to the second. Yes, sir.
I'm not sure if you understood this question, because this question, I think, doesn't have to do with diagnostics. His question is, in the diagnostic, you see that there is a small breast cancer. You see that there's a polyp that it's premalignant.
Okay.
Do you intervene? Because that's the debate that's going on, for example, among the group is, if we see a periapical lesion,
Do you do anything?
do you base intervention based on symptoms?
Okay.
And there's a group that says yes, and there's a group that says no. My point is, every time we see a tooth that is symptomatic, that has a lesion, at some point in the past was a lesion that was asymptomatic. So why are we waiting until it becomes symptomatic?
Okay, so hold on. Let me take advantage of the fact that I have the microphone. Okay. Your enthusiasm is admirable. Okay. So my first response is I totally missed the point of your question, and I apologize.
Okay. I was referring to all of those being asymptomatic.
Okay. But now there's this other question. The reason you cannot use the fact that symptomatic teeth tend to have lesions and therefore I should intervene when an asymptomatic tooth has a lesion is because you have no idea what the denominator is of teeth with lesions who remain asymptomatic for the entire life of the patient. You have no idea.
Misha, write that down. That's your answer. That's a very good answer. Right? You can't see this for some reason. You don't know what that number is. I don't know what it is.
I understand that I don't, but I do see all the symptomatic lesions.
Right. So this is the problem with when you see only the numerator and not the denominator. It's very hard to estimate the proportion.
Right. It's incumbent on us then to find out that.
Yeah. So
How do we do that?
Yeah. So
How do
that.
we find out what that number is?
So the way you find that out is you look at screening dental X-rays in asymptomatic patients over time, and you look at the number in a blinded analysis that have asymptomatic apical lucencies, and you look and see what fraction of those anything ever happens with.
Over what period of time?
Many years. Right.
It's almost an impossible study.
It's not that impossible because of the availability of digital images. You can do it retrospectively, right? You don't have to follow these people prospectively. You have to go in general dentist records. That's right. You guys don't talk to general dentists? Is that, okay. Okay. Right. So I mean, I'm going to make one comment, and I'll take your question. The thing that is just screaming at me in terms of the situation in which you find yourself is that you need to think creatively to identify a population-based group you can follow. okay? And I've said this to several of you. You got to find somebody, some group, where they are not going to get away. And I made a joke about them being in jail. That's probably not the best population. There's different dental practices in jail. But at least within California, for example, the Kaiser population would be a natural one. I don't know what Kaiser does as far as dental benefits and contracting for it. But for example, if there's a group of Kaiser members who have endodontal and dental benefits, you really need to think as a group of figuring out an observational research plan with Kaiser to get de-identified data, including the digital radiographs, so that you can start to answer exactly this kind of question. Because you're talking about diseases that progress over years or don't, and you don't know. You're talking about a disease in which you only see them when they're symptomatic, and then if they're asymptomatic, you lose them, or if they're continuing to be asymptomatic, they don't come back to you because they're mad at you, and you have no idea which. Okay? If you really want to show the value of what you do and understand what happens when you aren't there, you're going to have to find that population. I don't know where they are, but it would be if I was in the position of, from a scientific point, trying to advocate for your specialty, that would be my highest priority. Question in the back. Well, there's an intermediate question, is why don't you think it's a good idea? Okay, so let's talk for a second about lead time.
Also, how do you know it's an infection?
Well, that's what I was going. That's exactly the intermediate question. Let's talk about something called lead time bias and the Will Rogers phenomenon. Okay, anybody heard of the Will Rogers phenomenon? Stage migration, lead time bias. Okay, so. And I wish I had this quote. I need to have this quote on a slide. Will Rogers reportedly said something to the effect of, when the Okies moved from Oklahoma to California, it increased the IQ in both states. When the Okies moved from Oklahoma to California, it increased the IQ in both states.
That's really funny.
Yeah, okay. Okay. So the reason I'm pausing here is, apparently it's obvious. This is a profound thought. Now, it insults Californians and the Okies. The only people it leaves untouched is the remaining Oklahomans, I guess, right? Anybody here from Oklahoma? Okay. So the concept is that by moving a group that was inferior to where they started to a lesser functioning population where they're superior, you can make everybody look better. Okay? Now let's talk about survival time after discovery of breast cancer. So breast cancer imaging has gotten better and better and better and better. When women have lumpectomies and lymph node dissections, our ability to detect micrometastases to the lymph nodes have gotten better and better and better, more sensitive, okay, probably without losing specificity. What that means is that women 20 years ago who would be told, oh, it didn't spread, are now being, the exact same woman with the same stage of disease, are being told it spread to a few of your lymph nodes. So they're being classified differently, okay? That's called stage migration, because we're migrating them from one stage to a higher or worse stage, even though nothing has changed in the underlying patient. Well, what does that do to our estimates of the length of survival for any given disease stage? It makes the women who are without evidence of metastatic disease look like they live longer, because we've removed from Oklahoma the women who in fact had a worse prognosis, but we didn't know it. Right? Now the only people left in Oklahoma truly have no evidence of dissemination of disease. But what's happened over in California? Over in California, we've now taken women with the most subtle of metastatic disease and put them with the women who we always knew had metastatic disease. That makes that population look better too and have a longer survival. So now it looks like everybody lives longer with breast cancer, and all we've done is change the accuracy of our diagnosis. We have not helped a single individual. Okay? It's a form of lead time bias because the time you're identifying metastases earlier, or it's called stage migration for the obvious reasons, and the Will Rogers phenomenon is the more colorful description of it. Okay. So when you talk about looking at radiographs for apical lucency, I would want to know very well that you can do it in a way so that you can be consistent, and as the quality of the radiographs improve, you just don't start calling a lot more people as having lucency that you couldn't pick up. Because I get the impression that now you guys do these very high resolution x-rays and look at them with a magnifying glass. Is that essentially? Is that not right? Okay.
It's helping because it now see lesions that we never saw before.
Right. So that's exactly analogous. So now you're going to be able to demonstrate that people with lesions do a lot better than they used to. It's not because you've gotten better, it's because you're now calling people as having lesions when you didn't before. Okay? So that's a real issue. Okay. Okay, now what I would like to get to, oh wow, it's on. What I'm going to do is I'm going to, actually I've already given you the slides on retrospective chart reviews. Okay, so you can distribute those because we're obviously not going to get to that. We got to talk about missing data. Oh my God. Okay, so as specialists or subspecialists, depending on how you look at it, you have this problem that you are brought in when a patient is generally symptomatic, they have a lesion, you intervene, and then they largely disappear from your practice unless you make some concerted effort to bring them back, and even then you're only intermittently successful. Is that? Okay. So when data are missing, there are several different kinds of ways you can think about it. There's the way we sometimes think about it, which is, oh, I guess that patient never existed. We completely ignore them in our analysis. That's called complete case analysis because you only include in your statistical analysis the cases on which you have complete data. Okay? There's a kind of analysis where you do what's called single imputation. Imputation means I put a number in where there wasn't one. And single imputation means I pick a single number. So if the number could be a number that represents the tooth survived or the tooth didn't, but you assume something. And you can even do weird things where if you think 40% of those teeth will have survived 5 years, you even put like a fractional number in, but you put in a single number. Okay? Both complete case analysis and single imputation lead to tremendous bias, or at least potential for bias, because the patients who are lost to follow-up really are not the same as the ones who come back. The ones who come back, and it is notoriously difficult to predict what the differences are between those who come back and those who don't. Those who come back may be more, economically stable. They may be loyal for various reasons. They may have continued dental disease, so they keep needing to see you. There can be all kinds of reasons. Okay? People who don't come back may have died. They may have, why do I need to see a dentist? My teeth are fine. Maybe they don't come back because the tooth was pulled. They figure your job sucked and we're done. Okay? You have absolutely no idea. So the approach where you ignore the missing data or you put in a single number has the tremendous possibility of leading to bias in outcome estimates, and you cannot predict the direction of that bias. Now, because of that, as a general rule, studies that have any substantial loss to follow-up are not publishable in the highest quality medical journals because people just don't know what to do with the results. I was trying to think about a standard for this. In survey data, in which they're very, very lenient, the minimum number is 80%. It's a very common rule. If less than 80% of the people returned your survey, you just should not get published in a good journal. Okay? Some of your teeth follow-up rates are much lower than this. Okay. Okay? When you have a missing data problem, the most sophisticated way to try to address it statistically is to use something called multiple imputation. Multiple imputation is a technique where you put numbers, plural, that's why it's multiple, in for the missing data points, but you make enough different realizations of the patient so you capture your uncertainty in their outcome. So for example, I have an individual patient who showed up at 5 years and not at 10 years. I know at 5 years the tooth was still there. And multiple imputation, I would look at the patterns in patients who also had 5 and 10-year follow-up and who had similar demographics and baseline measurements and treatment interventions. And I might predict that the chance that missing patient had a tooth at 10 years is 50%. Just making up a number, okay? What I would do is I would make multiple virtual patients, and half of them I would put the tooth as being there, half of them I would put the tooth as not being there. So I create multiple different data sets. I analyze each one of the data sets separately, and I do that imputation for all the patients that have missing variables. And believe it or not, there's a statistical way to correct this so you don't underestimate the uncertainty in the regression coefficients if you're doing multiple regression. Okay, that's called multiple imputation. It's a very good technique. It's pretty effective unless what you have is called informative censoring. Okay. So when a patient doesn't come back, if it's truly a random event, you know, some of your patients get drafted and sent overseas, then any approach works because there's not bias associated with the missingness. The problem is the thing I've alluded to where your patients who are missing are fundamentally different than the patients who you can find and entice to come back. And that's called informative censoring because the fact that they're missing actually has information in it. There is no statistical method, including multiple imputation, that gives you an unbiased result when you have informative censoring, unless that censoring is completely explained by the other variables you have, which I almost didn't need to say because it'll never be true. Okay? So what that means is that if you want unbiased results, so you can estimate the benefit of your treatment, you have got to figure out a way to treat populations that you know you could hold on to. Okay? And this is, I mean, there are many different medical specialties that have run into this exact question, and I can assure you there is no shortcut around this problem. There is no way to massage the data to get rid of the bias associated with informative censoring. Okay? So that's kind of depressing. Okay? But you really ought to think of a group about my whole comment about identifying a captured population if you really want to try to get at this issue. Okay? There is another way to get at it, and that is to work with those who provide insurance benefits to argue for, and you want to listen to this, at least I hope you want to listen to this carefully. It is in the insurer's best interest to identify what therapies do and don't work, because the therapies that don't work, they don't want to pay for. The therapies that do work, they want to make sure their patients get so they're not paying for multiple other interventions, extractions, and...
They would be totally in favor of us finishing, restoring every root canal as soon as we finish it. It's a one-way financial street. The best practices thing only works when the insurance companies want it to work. They don't want it to work when it's in favor of the patient. You do not get where that's at.
So I certainly would not argue for the altruistic characteristics of insurance companies. But what I would argue for is there are some insurers who are in the position where their financial incentives are well aligned with the actual benefit to the patient because multiple courses of treatment are expensive and are often associated with worse outcomes. So for example, I cannot tell you for my own insurer whether that's true, but you should think about settings where that might be true, okay? The military is an obvious one, by the way, right? Because they end up having to pay for everything, so they really want to, okay? If you can identify, so if, you may be right, and it's a null space and this is pointless, but I'm going to proceed anyway. If you can identify a population in which the insurer is motivated to capture the effectiveness of therapies including these patient-centered outcomes because they're paying for all the course of treatment, then you can partner with those insurers in a deal where you help them collect data, design the studies, help them interpret it, and they help you collect the data because they make the collection of some of the data a requirement for reimbursement. Okay? So HMOs are a setting where this has occurred in other diseases. Okay? And you might want to think about whether, and remember, it does not have to be all the insurers or even a large insurer. The key here is your biggest problem seems to be missing data and loss to follow-up. Okay, so if you can identify any closed population who's likely to stay with that insurer for a prolonged period of time, and you can get them to agree, then you can collect the data.
You have the crux of the matter right there. I had, at one point in time, a few years ago, talked to somebody who was an insurance company that was fairly far up the food chain, and I asked him, I said, look, multiple studies have proven that, therapy X, Y, and Z works if you guys won't pay for it. His answer was this: actuarially, we know that patients switch insurance companies, jobs, whatever reason, fall in and out of the covered category often enough that the problem will be 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the line. It ain't going to be our problem. But it's a zero-sum. Everybody's working with the same population. In other words, the population of the United States. So what goes around comes around. But you got to get the entire insurance industry on board with that. And certainly.
Or you have to identify specialized cases in which the insurer has a more stable population. Okay, but it's true for frankly, the highest tier insurers and those that are associated with people who tend to go in and out of jobs, and with the relatively lower average time that people in executive positions spend in jobs, those are not the right insurers to look for captured populations. Okay? Okay, one thing about dealing with missing data. How many of you have heard of last observation carried forward? Is that something that's commonly used? You ever heard of this? This is the idea of whatever the tooth looked like at last visit, if they didn't come back, that must be what it still looks like.
I love it.
Okay.
I love it.
This is an absolutely horrible, evil approach that became popular because for a period of time, the FDA seemed to accept it as the best way of handling missing data. And the reason for this is that the FDA thought it was conservative. I'm not even sure this was, I know that they thought it was conservative. I don't know if they were right. And so therefore they thought that if when there was missing data, forcing people to just assume the same thing kept happening, okay, would tend to protect them against falsely approving drugs that were ineffective. But it's not a good approach, and especially in a setting like you have where you believe that your long-term outcomes may be qualitatively different than your short-term outcomes, it's something to avoid. And I'm just bringing that up so that you avoid it. Okay, let me just back up here. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is model building strategies. Okay, are we 15 more minutes, 10? Okay. Okay, and I'm not offended if people need to get up and leave. So, and I apologize for not having the time to go through one of the papers in detail, but one of the challenges that you all seem to have is how to interpret data that are gathered in roughly this idea. We have a large practice, seems to be often done with graduate students, and we enroll everybody, we collect all kinds of data about their baseline characteristics, what treatment was given, which we didn't really control. What happened, like that perforation thing and what was the flap inflammation, what did you call it? Flare-up. The flare-up thing, okay, and then some outcome, and let's just assume it's tooth survival so we don't have to have another argument over radiographic findings, okay? And you have all these variables, and you want to ask the question, how important, and this is an observational study, and you want to, just for prognostication, you want to answer the question, how important is each of these variables? Meaning if the patient smokes, should I tell them that that raises the risk of failure or death of the tooth by some amount? Okay? And there's two comments I want to make, or two general concepts. One is the difference between prediction and variable selection, and the other is collinearity. So hopefully I will remember those both. Okay. When you do a regression model basically asks the question, how much do these independent variables affect the likelihood of the dependent variable, which we're going to use as our example as the dichotomous outcome of tooth survival. And you have a long list of predictor or independent variables. Okay? The way these studies are generally done, they have a table at the end, and boy, you guys bury them 20 or 30 pages in. You guys have the most verbose literature I have ever read, okay? Where you have a table where you list the variables that survive through some complicated model building strategy. Usually something like, we screened each of the variables independently to see if it was associated with outcome. Those that were associated with outcome with some particular p-value, we put in a multivariable model. Then in the multivariable model, if they still looked good, we kept them. If they didn't look good anymore, we dropped them out. And we did this through several stages until we had our 12 predictors of outcome or 13 predictors of outcome. Does this sound familiar? I don't know if you guys think. Okay. Because that was about 20 pages I just did right there, okay? Okay. And when you look at that table, there's two pieces of information a clinician might take from it. One is, what are the variables that are important? That's called variable selection or identification of the predictors. The other is, how important are they? So those would be the odds ratio measures for how much does having one of these predictors of a bad outcome increase the chance of tooth failure, tooth death. Okay? Unfortunately, a regression model is fundamentally aimed at answering neither of those questions. A regression model is a way of doing prediction, which is saying if you had a new patient in whom you had measured these 13 variables, can you predict what their probability is of 5-year tooth survival or 4-year tooth survival, whatever it is? That's what a regression model does. So the techniques that are used in at least the papers I looked at, where you do this screening of multiple variables and let the data decide which ones survive till that last table in the manuscript, is highly unreliable. And what I mean by I mean this in a very rigid sense. What I mean is, if you did the exact same study again, you used the same inclusion-exclusion, the same graduate students, just different set of patients, and you did the whole thing and you went through that whole model building strategy, the chance that you would get the same list of predictors is very, very close to zero. It's unreliable, meaning you can do the same thing more than once and have a different result, unlike the car that's reliable. Okay? So I place virtually no stock in the specific identification of the predictive variables. Okay? So how could you do it differently and have a better chance of having a set of variables that you could be more assured is the right list of predictors of an outcome? The way you would do that is you wouldn't let your data pick the variables. You would use what you know about the biology and what you've observed in your clinical practice to identify the list of likely predictors. And I would want you to come up with probably 5 to 8. 5 if you could do it without hurting each other. Okay? The reason for that is inherently Bayesian. It's because I want a set of predictor variables that I know have a high enough pretest probability, pre-study probability, prior probability of being the right ones, because they make sense, they match your clinical experience, etc. Then I'm going to be using the data from the trial and the regression fit, using those as the predictors to estimate the magnitude of their association. That is a coherent method of model building, because I've separated the prior information, which is in the list of variables you give me, from the likelihood function, which is the data, which then gives me the regression coefficients that tells me which variables really are important and how important are they. Okay? The model building strategy, where you let the data do everything in this ill-defined way, mingles the prior information and the current likelihood in a way that gives the data such sway over the variables that the variable selection, the details of what you ended up with, not you personally, but what the authors ended up with, is likely reflects the noise in the data as well as the actual information that were there. okay? So the variable selection strategies used here are inherently unreliable. They're known to be unreliable, and they reflect statistical practice of about 15 years ago. So that's something that to pay some attention to. Let's see, I said variable selection. What was the other one? Collinearity. Thank you so much. Okay, the last topic I want to bring up. So collinearity is the tendency of two different predictive variables to be correlated with each other. Okay? So let me do a classic one. Let's do smoking and excessive alcohol use. Okay? So just out of curiosity, is alcohol use something you guys, that affects dental health? It does, right? No, not your social life. Does it affect dental health? Okay. Oh, that's interesting. So it's not a huge issue. Well, I'm going to use it as an example because I know the correlation for it. Okay. So what is the smoking behavior of patients who self-identify as alcoholic? They generally smoke. What is the drinking of behavior of people who smoke? They're not, it doesn't mean they're alcoholic, but they do generally drink. Okay? So there's a correlation between the two. So what happens if you include both smoking and drinking in a predictive model of, let's just do general health, okay? Because clearly you believe they affect, okay? What do you think happens? So the question is, you do a regression model, your predictors are, do you drink, do you smoke, and the outcome is some measure of health, exercise.
One hides the other.
Yeah, you and I talked in the break. Okay. Okay. So the answer was one hides the other. They steal the effect of each other because they are correlated. They are collinear. They measure the same thing. If you like, they're both, at the risk of being overly judgmental, they're both poor lifestyle decisions. Of course, I ate bacon at breakfast and then I ate a hamburger at lunch. So, okay, but those are also poor lifestyle decisions, right? Okay, so they're correlated with each other, so they're measuring kind of the same characteristic. It's kind of okay because you can look for an interaction of the two. Maybe you think of them as independent decisions, but let me show you where this is a real problem. So when you have a predictive model in your papers that have true baseline characteristics, and you have other predictive variables in your model that are therapeutic misadventures or poor proximate outcomes, now your estimates get completely confused. So if, for example, let's suppose that diabetes is a risk factor for a poor outcome, and it's a risk factor for having a flare-up. Okay? If your regression model shows a positive odds rate, a non-1 odds ratio, a 2, say, for diabetes, and a 2 for if a flare-up occurs. If you take the flare-up out of the model, the regression coefficient for diabetes is going to get even larger because now the effect of the flare-up is captured in the diabetes because the diabetes is a risk factor for the flare-up. Okay? Now, why is this important? It's important because when you are trying to risk stratify your patients, and you're trying to tell them, because you have diabetes, I need to warn you that your risk of a bad outcome changes by X amount. If the model included the flare-up in it, which is an outcome, not a predictor, the X that you tell them is wrong. You haven't told them the effect of diabetes. You've told them the effect of diabetes somehow removing the effect of diabetes causing a flare-up. And yet that's part of what the diabetes is doing if they're correlated. It's increasing the risk of a flare-up. I assume a flare-up is an infectious complication? Okay, so presumably diabetes doesn't. Okay, you guys can't agree on that. So, okay. So does that make, this is really important. So when you confuse baseline predictors with proximate outcomes and you put them all, and you act as if they're all predictors in your model, they steal each other's effect give you the wrong results for the real baseline predictors, and you get quantitatively the wrong answer in saying what the effect is on the likelihood of the outcome you really care about, like tooth survival or radiologic clearing. Okay? So that's called collinearity because of the fact that those two predictors tend to go with each other and therefore confuse each other. So when you're reading your literature, and if you're involved in discussions about design, please pay particular attention to having the predictors be things that are true predictors. Now, Gary made the comment that you will be in a position where your patient comes back and they've had a flare-up, and you want to be able to tell them, what does that tell you about that individual patient's long-term chance for a good outcome in terms of tooth survival. To do that model, you have to have in the model just the flare-up and the other characteristics of the patient at that point in time, not their baseline stuff. Okay? Because now they're at a different point, and the model needs to be based at patients who get to that point. Okay? It's a different model. Okay? Maybe the same, it may be a subset of the patients, right? Because some of those patients never got to that point. And it has ones that did have a flare-up and didn't, but it's everybody who came back at that point. Does that make sense? You want the model to be based on the population at the same point in care about which you're making inferences. Okay? All right, well, this has been an absolute pleasure. I hope it was useful to you. I'll stick around a few minutes for questions if people have other questions. Some of you still have energy, which is inconceivable to me. And I really wish you the best in the rest of your conference. Thank you very much.